All the aliens working. I'm going to begin. This is going to be the 20th anniversary panel for Platypus. It's going to be in a typical panel format. We'll have presentations, responses, and then Q&A. Read the prompt. I'll present our full panelists, I suppose. Spencer Leonard, Pamela Nagalas, and all of them experienced members of Platypus, both young and old. And I'll read the prompt. The history of the left is marked both by continuity and change, and haunted by the question of historical recurrence. In 1906, Leon Trotsky, speculating on how the dates 1789 and 1848 were taken up by the left of his time, wrote, quote, "History does not repeat itself. However much one may compare the Russian Revolution with the Great French Revolution, the former can never be transformed into a repetition of the latter. The 19th century has not passed in vain," unquote. 60 years later, having witnessed the great betrayals of the left by reneging on its historical consciousness, Theodor Adorno advised to his students in the New Left that, quote, "The theorist who intervenes in practical controversies nowadays discovers on a regular basis, and to his shame, that whatever ideas he might contribute were expressed long ago, and usually better the first time around." Pace Trotsky, the left today is locked in the cycles of the past. The regression of historical consciousness endemic to the left since perhaps 1917 has not revealed mistakes to be overcome so much as rendered them more opaque. Platypus seeks to press on this opacity, to ask of its conditions of possibility, of how a drastic experience of our distance from the past can deter us from making the same mistakes. When Platypus began in 2006, it had observed that the boomer generation of new leftists sought to intervene in the millennial left by warning against repeating their experience, their mistakes. But by the mid-2020s, the millennials advised the Zoomer generation to affirm the logic of the 60s. The struggle continues. It was undetermined 20 years ago whether a millennial left could overcome the burdens of its history and again attempt to recover the mediation of theory and practice. Today, with Trump dissolving the left's canards of the last 100 years, that is, of the 20th century, instead, the millennial left seems to have been the last gasp of the 20th century. In this light, we ask, how has the history of the left in the 21st century remained beholden to the terms of the 20th? How has the left's historical repetition been indexed by and deepened through Platypus? And I'd like this, and I think we can start with Spencer and then go down the table, if that's okay.
So this is going to be
I'll Spencer use the microphone.
a bit personal, I suppose, or as it were, from my own personal perspective.
It's not on. It's not on.
I don't know. 8 years ago, I appeared on a panel similar to this one with Ian Morrison, Tom Carey, Ed Remus, and Omer Hussein. Aaron was the moderator. At that time, my task was to cover the second phase of Platypus in light of the conclusion of its first decade. The second phase of Platypus is that inaugurated by the election of Obama. The previous fall, not before the election of Obama, but before the panel that I appeared on with Ian and the others, Chris had published The Millennial Left is Dead. In the summer, following that panel, the DSA got AOC nominated in place of Joe Crowley, guaranteeing that she would be elected to her first term in Congress. The year after, the ISO formally dissolved itself. Though in my remarks I concentrated on the second phase, I also took the occasion to reckon with the entire first decade, something that I addressed more extensively in my introduction to the second volume of the PR Reader. This time, in part because I'm stepping back from major roles that I've played in Platypus, I will proceed a bit differently, addressing Platypus's emergence from my own perspective. When I was the age of many of the people in this room, when I was 20, the basic outlines of what was to come were already coming into view. There was Operation Desert Storm in the Gulf and the Rodney King beating. The Soviet flag was lowered for the last time. The Convention for a Democratic South Africa was negotiating the end of apartheid. The first Super Nintendo game system was introduced, and the World Wide Web was publicly launched, and the first cell phone call made. The open source Linux operating system was released, and what is arguably the last rock and roll album, Nirvana's Nevermind, came out. It so happens that I traveled to India for the first time that year, beginning my lifelong study of that country. And there it was the last year of Nehruvian socialism and the beginning of the neoliberal reforms that eventually transformed that country. While not directly attributable to those reforms, of course, but also inextricable from them, hundreds of millions of Indians have been lifted out of extreme poverty in the intervening 3 decades. It's a remarkable change that can also, and in many ways more dramatically, be seen in China, Vietnam, Indonesia, and other large Asian countries especially. At any event now, alas, it feels like little has changed since my 20th birthday. I was 30 on 9/11. I was again in India watching the Twin Towers fall at a friend's apartment on TV. Coming in the middle of the dot-com bubble burst, it felt like the end of an era, as indeed it turned out to be. At the same time, the Twin Towers fell at the time of a rising anti-globalization movement, very much the fruit of the 1990s. Here's how one prominent new leftist, become anti-globalization thinker, Barbara L. Epstein, understood the dynamics on the left on, as it were, the day before 9/11. This is from Monthly Review's September 2001 issue. For several decades, radicalism has been at low ebb in the United States, present in innumerable organizing projects, but lacking focus and momentum. The anti-globalization movement provides focus and momentum and holds out more hope for a revival of the left than any other movement has over the last 2 decades. The radical ideology that prevails among its core activists represents a soft and fluid form of anarchism. It is open to Marxist political economy, prefers small-scale communities, but does not necessarily rule out the need for larger ones as well, is suspicious of structures of authority, especially the state, but does not necessarily deny the need for state power in some form. Actually existing anarchism has changed, and so has actually existing Marxism. Marxists who participated in the movements of the 60s tend to have a sharper appreciation of the importance of social and cultural equality and of living according to our values in the present than did many members of previous generations of Marxist activists, unquote. The early anti-Iraq war movement began with the global protests of February 2003, and mass protests continued through 2004 in major Western cities. I attended the World Social Forum in Mumbai in 2004, and later in 2005 and 2006, mass rallies in London. I remember clearly attending a large public meeting in Mumbai convened by the Communist Party of Iraq, where the party ignited a heated debate by opposing resorting to violent armed methods to end the US occupation of their country. The Iraqi communists explicitly advocated for a resolution of their country's problems through the political process, including participation in the transitional government structure, despite its being under US influence, to move towards the building of a democratic Iraq. The Mumbai meeting was, as SWP leader Alex Galinikos wrote at the time, the peak so far reached by the World Social Forum, which is very much a 90s left phenomenon. being significantly organized by the two key organizations of the Indian left, the Communist Party Marxist and the Communist Party of India, CPM and CPI, alongside various Maoist organizations. I attended in the company of two figures Platypus subsequently engaged at my own prompting, Jairus Banerjee and Rohini Hinsman. 2 years later, in July 2006, in London, at the SWP so-called Marxism conference, Sunit Singh and I distributed the first formal statement by Platypus, drafted and sent to us from Chicago for the purpose. In September of that year, the SWP's Stop the War Coalition organized their Time to Go protest of tens of thousands against the Labour Party conference in Manchester. As the SWP socialist worker wrote at the time, the goal was to get British troops out of Iraq and Afghanistan and to get Tony Blair out of number 10 Downing Street. Prominent speakers there included George Galloway and Jeremy Corbyn. In the American midterm elections of 2006, opposition to the so-called wars on terror began to be converted into support for the Democrats. In that election, Democrats took control of Congress for the first time since 1994. The emergence of the Marxist left that provided the occasion for the formation of Platypus was, in this context, of the definitive exhaustion of the 1990s anti-globalization movement and the early absorption of the anti-Iraq war movement into capitalist politics, which was accompanied by the demand for a new leadership of the global Democratic Party. No Tony Blair, no Hillary Clinton. Recall that in 2007, Gordon Brown displaced Tony Blair as Labour Prime Minister. When he did that, he advocated the fighting of global terrorism required more than military force, and he oversaw the beginning of the withdrawal of British combat operations from Iraq and set up a formal inquiry into the war, eventually resulting in the so-called Chilcot Report of 2009, a document that more or less ably epitomizes the entire subsequent millennial memory of that war. January 27th, 2007, witnessed a mass rally organized by United for Peace and Justice on the National Mall in Washington, D.C. As one writer recalls, an estimated 100,000 protesters turned out to tell the new Congress, act now to end the war. In a fit of irrational exuberance, several hundred protesters tried to rush the Capitol, and while the crowd chanted, "Our Congress," at the police officers blocking their way. A forgotten insurrection. Democratic Congresswoman from California, Lynn Woolsey, stated from the podium at that rally, "We have an antidote to this insanity. It is what you sent us to do last November." The week after that demo, again quoting, UFPJ unleashed 100,000 grassroots activists on the Hill to swarm their representatives, demanding that they support withdrawal resolutions and join the Out of Iraq caucus. Platypus was formed just around this time, when the anti-war movement in Britain and the US was decidedly orienting itself around the Labour and Democratic parties. 2 years later, of course, Barack Obama rode the prevailing discontent with the wars to the White House. That was the end of the first and founding phase of Platypus. In this sense, we have always faced the circumstance that the left was oriented to capitalist politics. That is foundational to Platypus. It is one reason why we said the left is dead, long live the left. At the same time, we alone now uphold the memory of the reckoning with the inadequacy of the anti-globalization movement and the inadequacy of the Marxism that challenged it at that time. The Occupy movement was, in a sense, the last re-emergence of the old anti-globalization movement. Though, as anarchist, it also represented the faint demand for a politics independent of capitalist politics. I first really began to take part in Platypus in 2008. I remember first meeting many of our early members at the pub in the Ida Noyes building of the University of Chicago. It was in the fall. I just returned to the university to finish my dissertation. I still remember Pam and Laurie talking to me about what Chris had told them about me, and the two of them I distinctly remember as they got up to leave. Tana and Ben Bloomberg were also there. Prior to that, I'd only met Marco. Moshe Stone had helped me to get a fellowship at the Chicago Center for Contemporary Theory, and it was there that I wrote my first contribution to Platypus, my piece on Christopher Hitchens in the 11th number of the PR, which came out in March 2009. It was also at 3CT that we discussed, perhaps for the first time, how to ask a platypus question. It was where I first described the goal of trying to push speakers till their voices cracked as a metaphor for crystallizing the space where the left was absent. It was, for me at least, my first real discussion of our strategy of hosting and curating the left. It was in the context of our University of Chicago chapters having sponsored a lecture by Naomi Klein on her book, The Shock Doctrine, at which we were to ask the first question before questioning was open to the room. Soon thereafter, Chris, Richard, Attia, and I did The Decline of the Left in the 20th Century. That was early in our second phase, though scarcely aware of it at the time. I was fresh from doing extensive research on 18th century imperialism, which had involved deep conversations with James Vaughan. Much of the fruits of that, not to mention, of course, long conversations with Chris about teaching similar material at the University of Chicago, resulted in an expansion of our reading group syllabus in the second phase back into radical bourgeois philosophy. Around this time, I also undertook the role of editor of the PR, a role that fostered a deep and abiding friendship with Nathan Smith, who served in a sense as my assistant and understudy. This is much of the experience I reflected upon the last time I spoke on this panel. So these are some of the reasons why I am generally considered not so much a founding member of Platypus, though that is sometimes said of me as a kind of shorthand, but as rather a member of the pre-Platypus generation, Gen Zero, as we are sometimes called, and of the second generation of Platypus members. By, I think, 2010 and 11, I was drafted to serve on the OrgCom, a role that I served in for the next 10 years until a one-year hiatus, after which I served for another 5, from 2021 to 2026. Basically, I've served every year except one since Ian Morrison was president. As stated in this year's OrgCom report, I'm stepping down from this role this year to make room for younger members to gain this experience, because I'm no longer directly engaged with the Platypus chapter, and because, in general, I find myself withdrawing into my own writing and editing project. One word about this. Perhaps in my capacity as a member of the OrgCom, I'm now most associated in the minds of especially younger Platypus members with my contribution to how to relate to the death of the millennial left, with my contention that Platypus was built for the post-millennial moment, that everything about our project going back to 2006 implied that our success had to be measured in terms of how we survived the inevitable dissolution of the context that gave us birth. This was in part due to my sense of the depth of the regression of the post-political left that I have somewhat alluded to here. Also, looking back at the great precedents for our project, Marx and Engels as the party of two in revolutionary exile in the 1850s, and after the Paris Commune and the relocation of the First International to New York in the Great Depression of 1873, but also, and more poignantly, Trotsky in the Frankfurt School, and after the war, Trotskyism and Adorno, and eventually our New Left precursors, the Spartacist League, and the at least semi-self-conscious new leftists like Leszek Kolakowski, C. Wright Mills, Cliff Slaughter, Juliet Mitchell, Martin Nicolaus, Moshe Stone, Adolph Reed, etc. Looking back on them, and at the same time contemplating the scale of the task we set for ourselves, I thought if we were to make good on our organization and efforts, this would have to involve, first of all, our ability to survive our immediate moment, and in that sense, prove our historical right to exist. Only by, in that sense, rising to the level of our models and inspirations from the 19th and 20th centuries could we hope to go beyond them. So I opposed making a fundamental change in the direction that was contemplated under Joe Estes' presidency, and that we debated at the same convention at which the last History of the Platypus Critique panel was held. And I stuck with that decision through the crisis of important members' membership, the debates over which brought me back into the ORCOM for the beginning of Aaron's presidency. Since then, there have been many members go through crises that were similar to those of 2018, 2019, and even as in the same period, we have, of course, recruited a whole new layer of members. I will conclude with the last thing. I think of myself as consistently advocating in this second decade, which is the necessity of transmitting the history of our organization, its phases and its activities, as the precondition of any possible success, even as that has to be reconsidered fundamentally from how we thought about it in the past. That is, it remains necessary, even as our organization grows larger and its history becomes even more unassimilable to the young in any literal way, to transmit to new members the history of Platypus, to prepare or initiate them adequately for our project. We must leverage our history to make possible our work in the present, even as work in the present is the precondition for the archive to remain a living resource.
Hello, my name is Pamela Nogales. I'm one of the founding members of Platypus, one of the authors of our statement of purpose and our editorial statement of the Platypus Review, and current host of Ship Platypuses. Along with Lori Rojas, Marco Torres, and Benjamin Blomberg, we were part of the original organizational committee back in the day. When I was asked to speak on this panel, I was told by Farsad that I ought to take up how Platypus, quote, appeared to me back in its original founding moment. And I thought to myself, well, I've done that quite a bit, in fact, the best distillation of which can be found in my article, Helplessness Without History, published in the Platypus Review in October 2024, based on the teaching that I gave here at the University of Chicago that was prompted in part by the October 7th attacks, but also prompted by Spencer. My students at the time in the classroom were faced with a familiar question, I thought. Which side are you on? An enemy to thinking, which reminded me of why we founded Platypus in the first place. So I don't want to give the same talk. I certainly don't want to contribute to a kind of melancholic longing for the good old days gone by. The neurotic relationship to the past is an obstacle to our work. So I thought about returning not to our first panel, not to the question of imperialism, which is an awfully misleading way of entering the present anyway, but rather to our second panel from 2007, the 3 R's, reform, revolution, and resistance, the problematic forms of anti-capitalism. First, the panelists. Marissa Holmes. Millennial, documentary filmmaker, leading organizer in the New Students for a Democratic Society in Chicago, and later a big part of Occupy Wall Street in New York City. Then Michael Albert, boomer, editor of Z Magazine, author of Paracon, Life After Capitalism, an avowed Proudhonist who represented the guilty conscience of the New Left. Stephen Duncombe, Gen Xer, NYU professor, editor of the Cultural Resistance Reader, embodying a Deleuzian post-political imagination. Lori reminded me the other day that he was really the reason that we had the panel to begin with. The graduate students at the time who had tasked Chris to start the reading group wanted to confront their symptoms. And Duncombe was at the center of it. Still a big part of SAIC from what I gather from talking to the SAIC students, this Deleuzian postmodern imagination. Then we had Brian Holmes, also a Gen Xer, involved with the second life of the Italian formation Autonomia, a post-party political formation aiming to address the condition of workers in a flexible knowledge economy. And our very own Chris Catrone, Platypus, also a Gen Xer. It was a Gen X heavy panel. 3 out of the 5 speakers were part of that generation, and it was in conversation with a millennial and a new leftist. The post-political loomed large. The forum was moderated by Dakota Brown, among the graduate students who had originally asked Chris to start this reading group. This part of the founding generation of Platypus deserted the undergraduates, us, They got cold feet. The departure was expedited by the work of organizing this panel, which raised pressing questions about our organization, the we, as Dakota put it, its ends, and the centrality of 1917. They left shortly after the 3 Rs under the cover of a debate about Kronstadt. I was telling Marco the other night how at the time I had found this whole episode so difficult to understand. What did I know? I remembered staying up reading the Peter Kolchin book overnight after Dakota and Eric had confronted Chris, and giving my little report to our mini Platypus group when the undergrads got together before the reading group to prepare for the reading group sessions. I'd read the Kolchin, but admittedly hadn't really grasped what their disagreement was really about, or why it had necessitated a break. Listening to the panel now, almost 20 years later, I get it. It was about the history of the left, our orientation towards it, and yes, it was about 1917, the failure of the revolution, what we made of it. What did we want from this history? So Dakota and Eric left. And in leaving, they robbed us from learning from their accumulated experience of the left, of their years as part of the alter globalization movement, their work in anarchist and activist networks in Chicago, an accumulation of experience on the left which would have been useful for us during the disorienting years in Occupy. An auspicious beginning. Nonetheless, we carried on. Well, that's perhaps just a lengthy aside. Forgive the sprawling nature of my memory. Returning to the panel. So it is uncanny how much of what has played out over the course of the last 20 years can be heard from the conversation in the 3 Rs. From the standpoint of 2026, it seems as if all of the available paths from 2007 onwards were here, presented in capsule form. It was in this panel when, in his closing remarks, Chris asks the left, what do we have to do to abolish capitalism in 10 years? What will we need to do every day? What will we have to do right now to make sure that this generation is the last generation to experience capitalism? World Revolution, 2017. Alas, things have not played out that way. This is also the panel, by the way, at which the Spartacus League distributed their glorious anti-platypus creed. Platypus, pseudo-Marxist, pro-imperialist, academic claptrap. We were very proud to receive such a vitriolic denunciation.
Very true.
It provoked us to wonder, what was it that we were up to warrant such rebuke? The Spartacists, who turned down the invite but were present in the audience, interrupted the panel several times in their usual cacophony. It was a sight to see back then. Something about the conversation had gotten under their skin. What was it? It wasn't that Platypus was debating them. No, there was no debate. What disturbed them is what we were doing. We were hosting the conversation. What was this practice that we were building? This hosting of the conversation of the left. What kind of academic claptrap was it? Right, so I've set the scene. Now the conversation. The panel began with an unspoken premise, the absence of a revolutionary subject. Marissa said, today is not the time for revolution, but resistance will create the necessary conditions for a future, a more revolutionary opening, which currently escapes us. She, Brian Holmes, and Stephen Duncombe were all in agreement on this score. Now more than ever, argued Brian Holmes, resistance, quote, has become really necessary in the face of scientific and technological power appropriated by an elite, leading us to war and dangerous ecological catastrophe. What would be truly revolutionary is for us knowledge workers to impose the inquiry of how this power is used. This is the role of intellectuals, he argued. Description. But it was not the task of intellectuals to tell the working class what to think or what to do. The panel hinged on the rejection of the party formation. The post-political spirit of the Gen X generation found a common cause with the undigested legacy of the new left, internalized by the new SDS millennial, Marissa Holmes. What we need now, said Marissa, is what the global justice movement called a movement of movements, a slogan borrowed from the alter globalization movement, the high point of which was the protest against the WTO in Seattle at the end of 1999. Protesters then had accused governments of strengthening, quote, market freedom at the expense of social rights, and they demanded justice. But why would you need Marx or Marxism to demand justice? And why did Stephen Duncombe feel compelled to quote the Communist Manifesto? Because you can never do so enough, lulz. If what he wanted was a fight within the symbolic dimension of the imagination. Stephen Duncombe argued that while we cannot live in the fantasy of the future, fantasies are nonetheless important. Duncombe wanted us to recognize that the new workers, the new social force behind the future movement, were the rising tide of informational laborers who do highly symbolic work. So where is the consciousness of and what constitutes the working class at this moment, he asked. Who would become the new subject of social and political transformation? If we romanticize and fixate on earlier forms of class struggle, we ignore the more spectacular fronts and symbolic fronts. The workers were not coal miners or the 19th century proletariat. They watched television. They went to Las Vegas. Weren't they just like us? We are forming, shaping the new world into being through positive experiments of the imagination, and we ought to act as if we were in that world. The protesters, 3 years later at Zuccotti Park, would also hold up such fantasies. Duncombe seemed to want to rid himself of this history, of history altogether, or its burdens, of the 20th century. It was a postmodern move to create the world anew, only if just in your mind. I play a lot of video games, he said. That's my research. The escapist fantasies of the left hold a kernel of truth. We too want to be free of the 20th century. Duncombe also affirmed the slogan of movements, which is repeated again and again throughout the panel. It was the answer of what is to be done. But what did it mean in 2007? Chris suggested that hidden behind this slogan of cooperation was the undigested Stalinophilia of the New Left, a celebration of resistance movements where none takes up responsibility, the undigested Stalinophobia of the New Left, a celebration of resistance movements where none takes up responsibility for the ends of society. Behind the movement of movements is the fear of taking power, a kind of paralysis of political action shrouded in the language of Deleuzian revolutionary imagination, impotence disguised as a postmodern bacchanalia. Michael Albert, admittedly a much better panelist than I'd remembered at the time, cut to the chase. To the extent that I understand what you all are talking about, I know it's not about organizing the working class. If you're serious about creating a new economy, you would not talk to people in this way. In other words, he was saying, take yourself seriously, children. The left doesn't mobilize workers. It doesn't know how to speak to them. And a working person can feel the arrogance. So what should the intellectuals do? Albert presented the problem as that of forms of social association, which required new conceptualizations of labor and its organization. This requires intellectuals to study forms of alternative economies and to implement these visions, to present a bigger picture of the future, which allows regular people to imagine how their actions, their strikes and their protests, etc., plug into that much larger movement. We need a vision, he said. We didn't fail to do this on the left because we never tried. We, as in his generation, the new left. I was there, he told us. If what we want is to create a more participatory economy, it's Paracon, it's his project, we need to provide both a larger vision of a new global association and its benefits, as well as organize working people by creating civil society associations, deliver sport leagues, daycare, places where people can communicate. Do what the goddamn church does. People need hope in something bigger. Against Holmes, he argued, Albert, that the recognition that things are abysmal is actually greater than it had been in the last 40 years. The problem is not that people don't know the extent of the catastrophe. We don't need more fancy descriptions. We keep telling people how bad things are. They know. The problem is that we don't know what to do with these discontents. The blame is with us. This is rather different, a different tone than what we hear often at our panels today by the left. The left today comes to speak on our panels, and they tell us, man, you guys are right, the left is dead. And let me tell you, we agree with this premise. The left is bad because of X, Y, Z, but we are better. Michael Albert, on the other hand, said, we don't know what to do. At least he was honest. Albert also represented the guilty consciousness of the new left, the pangs of Stalinophobia. Listen, I hear you all invoke Marx and Marxism, but I don't know if Marx is what you want to go with. I wouldn't put my energy there at all. Marxism and Marxist-Leninism has a flaw. Lenin has nothing to do with the emancipation of the working class. Instead, it has left us with a legacy of political authoritarianism. It elevates the intellectuals into a ruling elite and does not create classlessness. People monopolize intellectual labor and become part of a coordinator class. The intellectuals become an obstacle to the revolution. The Spartacists spoke up from the audience. We defend the revolution of 1917. It is a litmus test. We provide unconditional military support for the USSR against the reformist socialists who stood on the other side of the barricades and supported the Islamic reactionaries in Afghanistan against the Red Army. We defend the deformed worker states. Well, you know the rest. Dakota, exacerbated by the lack of a question, pushed this young Spartacist member to please get to the point, to get to your question. And this young woman finished her lengthy presentation with the question, well, that's our program. That's what we stand for. What do you think about that? And the audience and several of the panelists burst out in laughter. I'm not sure what I felt at the time in the audience, probably some kind of amusement at the whole episode, but in retrospect, I find it depressing. The laughter was an indictment. Was no one taking this history seriously? The person who was speaking, after all, was young, maybe in her early 20s at the most. Even our moderator, Dakota, seemed dismissive. He turned to the panelist and cursorily said, anyone want to answer this? No? But Chris took her seriously. The importance, he said, of 1917, the greatest defeat in the history of the socialist left. It was a moment at which at least 1 million strong worker revolution aimed at a global transformation took up the task for socialism, but it failed. And its defeat haunts us. We live in the accumulated wreckage of defeats. Indeed, as Marissa Holmes had put it, organizing the student left, one reproduces the obstacles on the left in microcosm. And as Nick Kreitman, Ben Blomberg, and Laurie Rojas and I were quick to discover in our new SDS chapters, this was true. All of the wreckage comes back. Sorting through it is no easy task, but it required a patient excavation, the willingness to make sense of history, the patience not to ask, what is to be done, but where do my visions of transformation come from? What world do I think I'm intervening in? What is my vision for changing the world? Where does it come from? Chris said that the most important aspects of 1917 were not, as Brian Holmes had declared earlier in the conversation, a modernizing anti-colonial revolution. This was a kind of rewriting of its meaning to suit the defeatism of the 1960s, which had taken for granted that the revolution in the metropole was impossible, had shirked from responsibility to take up the struggle of socialism where it could have had the most impact, here in the home of the American Revolution, the transatlantic republic, as Marx called it. Duncombe had also, in his own incoherent way, entertained this narrative. The most revolutionary forms of resistance to date have been the anti-colonial resistance movements and their calls for independence. Atia Khan spoke from the audience, I remember. So according to your assessment then, would Gandhian politics be considered revolutionary? Well, answered Stephen, you probably know better than I do. True. But I guess what I'm saying is that they have a positive vision, the calls for independence and the call to found a new state. Now, I don't know how I feel about the national state as revolutionary. Maybe this is not revolutionary, but it is towards something greater. The panel ends on a funny note. Chris calls for the left to make the revolution in 10 years, but it also includes his critique of the new SDS, which is worth repeating since it may sound strange to our young members. Chris argued that the problem, the bone he has to pick, the one bone he has to pick with the new SDS, he was being diplomatic, is that they were explicitly anti-ideological, unwilling to take up how the history of the left haunted the present, unwilling to examine, to make an object of study, the different visions for social organization and how they in fact did not sing in harmony. The movement of movements sought to rid itself of the sectarianism. Sound familiar? The McNairite wet dream, as Solomon put it to me last night. Ideology is the enemy. And if the only way that the history of the left could be examined would be through factional fights and renunciations and vitriol, as if the only way that the history of the left could be examined would be through factional fights, renunciations, and vitriol. Platypus wanted to tell the left, go do your work, go organize, fight, build your strength, then come to our panels, subject yourself to examination, ask yourself, what is this all for? Have the time, take the moment, take the opportunity to consider how your work may be part of something greater. Take the time to clarify it to yourself, to your members, to your students, to the new generation. Tell them how your orientation towards theory and practice is helping you advance a greater emancipatory vision of society. And if you find yourself depressed at the prospect of thinking about your political activity, if you find it to be one damn protest after another, wouldn't you want to stop and think about how you could move forward differently? Couldn't we, in hosting the conversation, preserve the possibility that the left may yet live again? May again say yes to the world rather than be ridden with guilt and embarrassment, shame even, about its own history? The millennials today lie about what they hope to do. We never meant to build socialism, they say. We just wanted 1970s Swedish-style social democracy at best. We just wanted to build a big tent organization. We just wanted a little bit of a reprieve from the neoliberal tyranny. Lies. I was there. Those of us remaining in this organization, the millennials who have not lied to you, children, may yet have something to teach you. What will the students task their teachers with? That's up to you. Maybe we could still remake the world anew. That's up to us. Unlike the graduate students, we have not left. What do you need from us? The moment is now to figure it out.
Okay, so in an earlier version of this panel prompt, I was asked specifically to address the year 2016 as the year of the election of Donald Trump, as 10 years ago. Also because I joined around then, I joined Platypus in 2015. The new prompt was circulated a bit later. It no longer asks for that. It asks me instead to address the questions posed in the prompt through my personal experiences in Platypus. So I thought it was worthwhile sticking with 2016 for a bit. And I am going to talk about why and how the election of Trump in 2016 motivated Platypus. And there's a couple of reasons I'm going to do this. The first is that I think it's important to try and recall what Platypus meant to me, right, when I first encountered it. Before it meant, right, what it means to me now is, am I causing consternation?
No, it's okay.
Okay. Before, is everything okay?
Yeah, it's fine.
Okay. I hope everything's okay. Before it's become kind of habit, something I've done for a long time, right, and to remember when it was new. And the other reason is because I think that Trump in 2016 raises actually some fundamental questions about what Platypus is doing, and specifically about the concept of the left, right, which Platypus takes as its starting point. Okay, so I'm going to talk about that a bit later in the talk. Thanks, Pam, I'm so sorry. Okay. Goodness. Sorry guys, I have allergies. A few weeks ago, we hosted a panel at Columbia University on imperialism. And we kind of didn't want to. We had at first tried to do a panel on Iran, and we walked into the minefield that is the Iranian left exile community in New York. And were unable to do that, so we did an imperialism panel. And following the panel, one of our members, Jean, came up to me in the reading group and said, "The left is not only dead, it is brain dead." Okay, this sort of frustration with Platypus panels seems to me to be pretty much representative of our moment of Epstein hysteria and Zionist conspiracies, and also of the experience of the Zoomers in general, who are fed up with the left. They would like, if possible, following Edith Fischer, to dissolve the existing left and elect a new one. But this was not exactly the experience I had when I first came to Platypus in 2015. I was a somewhat abortively punkish youth discontented with Obama's America. I had watched Occupy on Twitter, encountered identity politics on Tumblr, and the vanguardism versus full communism debate on Reddit, that's the internet. I lived through the legalization, I lived as a high schooler, through the legalization of gay marriage, and I thought it was cool that my lefty friends in my conservative redneck Bible Belt town, where a friend of mine had been literally entrapped into an actual exorcism for the crime of being a gay saxophonist, were against gay marriage because marriage was bad. And I was proud of having been accused by my high school principal of wanting to start the Gay Panthers because my friends and I held up signs making fun of the Baptist church, football, and all of society's inherited institutions at a pep rally. I watched with horror the 2014 bombing campaign in Gaza and circulated videos of the 2014 shooting of Michael Brown, which sparked Black Lives Matter protests of the Obama administration in the summer before I entered college. I didn't know what any of this really meant, but I was intrigued by the idea of Marxism and communism as somewhat subversive and old and historical, and I was willing to try out any and all ideas as long as they seemed different from where I grew up. It was in the midst of this kind of inchoate curiosity that I found Platypus at the University of Chicago. One of the very first panels, well, actually all of the very first panels I ever attended were at the 2015 International Convention here, held a few months after the first time I went to a Platypus reading group that January. The closing plenary of this convention was, "What is political party for the left?" The topics of discussion included many topics that our newer members or somebody who has encountered Platypus recently might wrongly associate with Platypus only in the post-Trump period. Bonapartism, the state, politics, who, the crisis of political parties, the relationship of capitalism to socialism, the relationship of the left to capitalist politics. But in fact, this took place in early 2015, before either Trump or Bernie were really on the horizon. The panel was organized in the context of new party formations in Europe in response to the Eurozone crisis. Podemos in Spain and Syriza in Greece foremost amongst them. And perhaps more obscurely, the unsuccessful mayoral campaign of Chuy Garcia in Chicago, which had occurred in 2014, and around which, I was told, there had been some talk of Chris Catrone running for alderman in Chicago. Can you guys imagine? Okay. These new parties were described on the panel by Chris as the late arrival of neoliberalism in Europe. This was generally accepted by the panelists, which was conditioning a crisis of inherited European social democracy. These new parties were in a double bind. They opposed the existing social democratic parties, but were still beholden to them. For instance, Syriza was forced to recruit bureaucrats from the ranks of their enemies in PASOK, the Pan-Hellenic Socialist Movement, legacy Social Democratic Party in Greece. The full flowering of neoliberalism in Europe was also its political crisis. The crisis of the capitalist state conditioned the crisis of political parties, and specifically the legacy left political parties. This posed the task of the reconstitution of an independent socialist party of the left, point blank. But to do so, one had to deal with the inherited baggage of the historical left. This baggage was not only literal, the actual existing bureaucracies of the old social democratic parties, as the European deep state, and we could say also, as a questioner raised from the audience, the trade union bureaucracy in Chicago, through which all money and energy for the Chuy Garcia campaign had to be funneled, but also ideological baggage. This dynamic was mirrored by the crisis of Jacobin in that year, which was raised on the panel. It had started, Jacobin had started out trying to overcome the difference between the DSA and the ISO, the Democratic Socialists of America and the International Socialist Organization, a kind of old Cliffite group that really was dominant on campuses when I came to Platypus. Okay. But in 2015, it had begun, Jacobin that is, under the pressure of Syriza et al., to simply republish actual articles from the ISO Socialist Worker. Okay, so they weren't getting new articles for their journal. They were going to the Socialist Worker, ISO, kind of proprietary journal, republishing this in Jacobin. And this was brought up on the panel. And one of my favorite kind of quotes from this panel is when Adolf Reed Jr. says in response to this that Jacobin, quote, combines the play anarchists, real anarchists, libertarians, posers, and the Brooklyn coffee house left together, and that if you want to do the left, you should look elsewhere. Sounds an awful lot like the ISO, right? That's basically what the ISO was. Compare the writers list in Jacobin today to socialist workers, say in 2010, and you'll find a lot of overlap. Jacobin, as representative of millennial Marxism, and we'll talk about millennial in a second, revitalized Cliffite intellectual culture and the DSA as an organization, the two things it had attempted to overcome. A little remembered fact of the DSA bubble after Trump was elected in 2016 is that one of its first major votes was to leave the Second International, called the Socialist International. They did so because they wanted to break with social democratic parties around the world that had, quote, implemented neoliberal policies. This included the German SPD, Hollande's Socialist Party in France, Peña Nieto's PRI in Mexico, the Indian Congress Party, and the Greek PASOK. But what really carried the vote was that the Socialist International refused to support BDS, boycott, divestment, and sanction of Israel. But this had not happened yet during our panel in 2015. Trump had not been elected, the DSA had not grown, and the left had not yet decided that neo-social democracy would be the solution, not really solution, to the crisis of neoliberalism. There was an openness to thinking about what political party had been and what it meant for the left. The specter of sectarian Trotskyism, the Kautskian party of the whole class, and the necessity of building a left different from a movement or a party organization hung over the discussion. The panelists were ambivalent about all of this. Perhaps everything that each of the panelists said was necessary and true. You needed a movement. You needed political independence from the Democrats. You needed to rediscover the left as a concept in thought and practice. You needed to overcome the taboo against authoritarianism. After all, Tom Riley remarked, Engels said revolution was the most authoritarian thing there is. And for precisely this reason, that it was necessary, the panelists told us that none of it could be done. Why? Well, because of the inherited baggage of the left. So Chris kind of tried to thematize this in his opening remarks. Marx's necessity of the dictatorship of the proletariat was the same necessity as that of state capitalism in Bonapartism. Hence, the history of Marxism after Marx is inseparable from the history of state capitalism, in which the issue of the dictatorship of the proletariat was inextricably bound up. This cast a light backwards on the Second International, formed out of the Lassallean Social Democratic Workers' Party of Bismarckian Germany. Was the political party for socialism just a form of Bonapartism? So the question is the politics of the organized state. A Marxist approach would try to grasp state capitalism as its Bonapartist state, as a form of suspended revolution. I'm quoting here from the panel. Indeed, as a form of suspended class struggle, the struggle for socialism or its absence affects the character of capitalism and its politics. And one more quote that came up on this panel that I thought is relevant to this discussion. The history of the state in the modern era is inextricable from the politics of revolution. The crisis of the state is always a crisis of political parties. Crises of political parties are always crises of the state. The crisis of the state and its politics is a phenomenon of the crisis of capitalism. Looking back, I feel as though this panel was raising questions that had appeared at the start of Platypus. The question of breaking with the dead left was being posed again in and through the crisis of politics. This raises the issue of the left as such, which Spencer brought up in his opening remarks. That the left, part of the reason the left is dead is that it's oriented fundamentally towards capitalist politics. Okay, but this kind of creates a problem. If the left is fundamentally oriented towards capitalist politics and this makes it the right, how is it even possible to think about, let alone ask about, the task of a reconstituted left? How can you actually think that there could be a concept of the left and hold discussions about it, which is what Platypus is trying to do, right? The election of Donald Trump and the Bernie Sanders campaign were the occasion for the left of that time, the millennial left, to liquidate themselves completely into capitalist politics, right, behind the literal electoral campaign of Bernie Sanders. But then Hillary Clinton. So later that year, Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump announced their respective insurgent candidacies within the Democratic and Republican Party. I know it seems funny now, but if you made a joke about Hillary Clinton in late 2015, that was enough to get you denounced as a progressive white liberal by your classmates. Nobody thought Trump was serious. Everyone called him a racist. But on SNL, Larry David said that he only called Trump racist because somebody paid him to do it. So nobody actually believed it, except for the left. At the seminary co-op later that year, I attended an event on feminism and Hillary Clinton, on which Doug Henwood, Lisa Featherstone, and Jasmine Nair spoke. The panel raised, this was not a Platypus panel, but it was interesting nonetheless, and it raised the new social movements of the new left, which, as Featherstone and Nair admitted, seemed to have simply terminated in Clinton's defense of neoliberalism and feminist pussy hat marches. A student from the audience asked what to do if Trump won the election. Doug Henwood said, "Kill yourself." A few months later, Adolph Reed Jr. told UChicago students that, also at the same co-op, that if Trump were elected, people like us would be put in concentration camps. Trump won the election, and everyone who had a year ago been telling me to question the left around me, that there wasn't a left, that we needed to dedicate all our time and energy to working out the problems of the past, that I should avoid the Brooklyn coffee shop K-hole, was telling me that I needed to sign up for the DSA to fight Trump. I needed to dedicate my life to explaining to woke Democrats that the problem isn't gentrification, it's class. I needed to, quote, this is Adolph, a lot of this is Adolph Reed told me these things. I needed to vote for the lying neoliberal warmonger. Okay, so what was going on, right? And why does this why am I saying that this is raising the problem of the left? Okay, is 2016 the millennials 1848? Is it their 1917? Is it their 1933? Is it their 1968? Many people thought these things, right? All of these things were raised. This is what's happening. This is the moment where social democracy betrays us. This is the moment where the fascists take power. This is the moment where the people are going to come out in the streets, like Paris in May 1968. Or was the left not only dead, but brain dead? Was this the long-awaited destruction of all consciousness on Earth? No, I would say no. In a way, it felt to me at the time, and maybe this is just because of my proclivity for English literature, that Trump was prosecuting the crisis of the capitalist state in the absence of the left. He was Prince Fortinbras invading Denmark, and it was the millennial left's Act 4, Scene 4 of Shakespeare. How all events do inform against me and spur my dull rage, and I do not know why yet I live to say this thing's to do, sith I have cause and will and strength and means to do it. Examples gross as earth exhort me. Witness this army of such mass and charge, led by a delicate and tender prince, whose spirit, with divine ambition puffed, makes mouths at the invisible event, exposing what is mortal and unsure to all that fortune, death, and danger dare, even for an eggshell. Rightly, to be great is not to stir without great argument, but greatly to find coral in a straw, when honor's at the stake. How do I stand then? As leftists love to tell you, the rubber hits the road. The left was calling to get serious by avoiding the task of their time. The DSA split with the Socialist International so that it could continue and retrench the assumptions and practices of the very left they were breaking with. In this sense, it was a complete farce. But what would it mean to make coral in a straw? Literary scholars debate whether Hamlet, and by extension Shakespeare, is being ironic or serious with this statement, by the way. I tend to think that perhaps it is meant to be both and neither, both ironic and sincere, and also neither, but an open question of whether and how one could really greatly find coral in a straw. But if it means splitting your organization over boycott, divestment, and sanctions, and the capital portfolios of major universities, then truly the ironists are the winners. And maybe I shouldn't be quoting Shakespeare, but Mephisto. Everything that exists deserves to perish. But at the same time, the liquidation of the left into capitalist politics seemed to be raising from within that problem, right, of the death of the left, the question and task of a new left. Okay, this is what I meant when I said that Trump seemed to me at some way to get at the problem at the heart of Platypus, right? How can you think about something that we're saying doesn't exist? How can one say the left is dead, long live the left? And I felt that a task Platypus had given itself, in a way, was to be able to raise the question, right, continue the discussion it had started at the beginning of the millennial left about the task of a new left, right, continue to question whether we know what a left is, what it might be, and what it may yet become, in and through the instantiation of that problem in a political crisis, right, in capitalist politics itself. So in a way, it seemed to me that, like, in and through the literal liquidation of the millennial left, and by the way, so on this panel, Adolph Reed Jr. makes the point, right, that millennial, Gen X, these things are marketing categories. Why do we talk about the left in marketing categories? Well, marketing categories come from capitalist politics and change, right? They come from how the world changes and how that affects kids when they grow up and affects what products they might want. And because the left is completely oriented to capitalist politics, we experience it through these marketing generations. Okay, there we are. Sorry, guys. But I felt that, in a way, the liquidation of the left into capitalist politics was deepening the ideological problems that everyone in Platypus was telling me I should pay attention to. The left was deeply ambivalent about Trump. This was expressed through anti-Trumpism. Anti-Trumpism was the fear of the Trump fascist 100-year Reich, but it was also a wish for it. A fear is also a desire. The left wanted Trump to win and destroy everything, freeing them of their task of making socialism. They wanted Trump to knock away their old enemies, and they wanted this desire was expressed through hysteric fear of any and all change. Lenin used to say that Marxists needed to be as radical as reality itself. But what did this really mean? To be as radical as the counter-revolution, as the revolution within the counter-revolution? To be as radical as the bourgeois revolution? But what was the bourgeois revolution? Was capitalism an advance on the bourgeois epoch? Did proletarian revolution supersede the bourgeois revolution? Or was the horizon of the bourgeois revolution social justice forever beyond our grasp? Trump was forcing all of these issues by representing social justice. At the very moment, he also seemed to be putting it off forever by destroying the social justice that the new left had supposedly given us. Trump also forced the left to confront its own illiberalism. The necessity of socialism expressed negatively through Bonapartism meant that the politics of that state were in question. It raises the issue of citizen control of the state and its subordination to the freedom of society, i.e., is politics, people organize to use state power to transform history. Trump took up this task of citizen control of government, which the left had abdicated. Liberalism in its 19th century form was a consciousness of the failure of socialism to answer this freedom question politically. The dictatorship of the proletariat would also have to be a form of social dissent, reasserting the right of society over the state. It would be like Trump, a minority forcing the majority to be free. What does this mean practically? How did historical Marxism take up this problem? What were the obstacles to recognizing this in the present? What are the necessary preconditions to becoming conscious of the revolution and the counter-revolution? All of these questions were floating around in my head. History was posing them to me in a moment of need. What did this motivate? To me, it motivated the necessity of Platypus. I found through panels that any answer I could give to these questions, somebody on the new left had given them before, and better. They'd had all these debates, they'd thought about all these things. And I was tasked with learning from their experience of that and thinking about how the present might repeat the past, if in a different form. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. So I was asked to, this is on, right? Okay. I was asked to comment on the period of the last 3 years, since 2023. Now, I joined Platypus when I was 21 in 2020. And I think my time of politicization was around just after the period you're talking. It was around Trump, actually. So 2017, 2018, I was in Antifa. I was in my student climate change movement. I didn't, but my friends door knocked for Jeremy Corbyn. And my university was celebrating the 50th anniversary of the 1968 protests. I remember crying at the documentary about AOC being elected, like tears in the sociology department of LSE. And I remember thinking Trump was a fascist, and that I was going to face, we would have to turn to the left if we were to fight fascism, right? That was the level on which I found the left as a younger person. And I think for in encountering Platypus, it was posed to me what was the first, or I think for the first time that the left wasn't so much about equality or progress, but that it was about freedom. And I think that made me very angry because I didn't understand exactly what that meant, but I kind of wanted to know, and it forced me to kind of think maybe all the stuff that I'm doing is misguided. I don't know. So why, I think during my education in Platypus, I'll put it this way, when I was thinking of 2023, I was reflecting on the sense of timelessness, which I've been feeling. And I think that timelessness can come from kind of two areas. The first area is actually the process of being in Platypus itself can give a sense of living in a kind of washing machine of history. So I remember the moment that I really was like, cool, I need, after being very contentious with my local Platypus chapter for about a year, and like quitting over the summer and saying I'm never going to come back again, and then returning in September. And then Ephraim asked me to introduce his teach-in on the Labour Party and the left. And that teach-in was the first time that I realized that what my friends had been dedicating all of their spare time to, and our hopes for like defeating the far right at the ballot box, had been a kind of way of consolidating the left back into liberalism over and over and over again. And this had been a pattern since like the 1920s. And that really, every time the left had submitted itself to capitalist politics, it removed the question of freedom. And so there is this sense of timelessness where you're like, oh my God, we can't escape the present. The other sense of timelessness, I think, came when I became, a few years after I became a member and had done the reading group and was hosting coffee breaks, and during COVID, and I returned to campus and started talking to my students, and I was like, I don't know what the fuck they're talking about, and they don't know what the fuck I'm talking about. Like, they're like, who is Jeremy Corbyn? And I'm like, oh my God. And they wanted to ask me about, like, Mao. So this is kind of where I'll continue from this. I think my position here, and what I actually just have a very few remarks, but what I was thinking of, like, okay, as a member of Platypus who's trying to take responsibility, who has a history and now teaches, I think the first, who is like my audience, when I'm doing Platypus work. And I asked myself who I should be writing this for. So on the one hand, I have in mind my current students. And of the last 3 years, I want to help them understand the symptomology of the present moment, not only through continuities and discontinuities with the 20th century, So what language of the 20th century is being raised back up in the present? But also continuity and discontinuity with the millennial left. So kind of telling them, you know, you guys didn't just emerge via internet Maoism into like the bright, clear air, but that actually your interest, you know, turning to Reddit in 2021 as a 14-year-old maybe is conditioned by something that you don't know about. So where is the continuity and discontinuity with the millennial left? As a consequence, I would then be able to task myself and my teachers, the millennials of Platypus, with elucidating the self-understanding and critical potential of the millennial moment against a reified theory of history. What was the millennial left and what wasn't it? Finally, my hope would be that such a dialogue would be helpful for those seeking to reconstitute a Marxian left, to dispel themselves of the compulsions set by such ideological obstacles expressed and compounded in the last 20 years. A goal with which Platypus is in a particularly advantageous position to achieve, given that we have recorded the history of the last 20 years. So the question is, can we actually communicate it and make it meaningful again? But to summarize my kind of like proposition, or the way I was trying to think about this prompt of like, how are we evoking the language of the 20th century and how can we try to deepen it? I propose that maybe the character of the left in the last 3 years may be understood as following ideological theories of failure of the millennial left. So what kind of history is being evoked to understand the death of the millennial left? And obviously we've had a massive influence in actually trying to delineate those historical questions in themselves. But actually the way that the left in the last 3 years have been trying to think through their failures is ideological in the way that they recall history. So I'm just trying to find my place again. It is in these theories that the history of the left in the 20th century is used as an analogy to understand the present, thus facilitating a new generation of enslavement to the dead left, should we fail our task. So there are two kind of organizing analogies that we can propose for what we've been encountering the last kind of 3 years. First, that the millennial left failed because it was too new left. They repeated the mistakes of the 1960s. They were too anti-statist, too focused on identity politics rather than class, too anti-authoritarian, and subsequently balked or folded in the face of claiming or working towards political power or transformation. The new left paved the way for the constitution of neoliberalism, and the millennial left would be the last defenders of neoliberalism. So one way that this is kind of expressed is in the kind of like 1970s moment, right? So industrial turn, which we kind of captured with our 2023 convention. Third worldism, including a kind of, so the kind of evacuating of subjectivity of the kind of Western working class. It includes this kind of like multipolarity discussion. Anti-left Marxism, which again, we've kind of been engaging with off and on. I think of like Benedict Cryptofash. I think of like the brilliant London panel, which was called The Concept of the Left, where we hosted Philip Cunliffe. And when I asked him what, makes him not a conservative, he said, well, I want change. So because I want change, I can't be a conservative. And I highlighted that like 5 years earlier, he had written a book called Lenin Lives. Similarly, there's a kind of beyond left or right, which actually was helpfully kind of elucidated in Ephraim's essay about the publication of like Sublation, Compact, and Jacobin's refounding around the end of 2022. And he kind of talks about this kind of prevailing confusion about like, okay, we're Marxists, but we're not leftists, or maybe we have to go beyond both. So the other kind of like historical analogy that could be useful to try to think through the present is maybe the millennial left were like the renegade Kautskians, right? And that they became reformist or imperialist once they became too close to power. And this is either internally, like through internal moral failure, or externally. So kind of a way that this might come up is like, maybe it wasn't Bernie or Jeremy Corbyn's fault that they didn't win at the ballot box, but it was like the capitalists that dragged their name through the mud through and like fake anti-Semitism crisis. At least that's what it was with Corbyn. And this has kind of manifested within like what you must call like the Zoomer left or the current left today as like a question over Lenin and Stalin, but actually not Trotsky, at least I don't think. So there was this discussion over the last couple of years about like communism, like Zoomer communism. And there was, just remember, so actually in like Shit Platypus Says, we launched, maybe well not prematurely, but we attempted to launch a kind of continuous segment after seeing a lot of these like communist rebranding or regroupment kind of coming up. So like the IMT rebranded itself to the RCI, the Revolutionary Communist International, and it's proliferated massively across campus. And part of this, we in London went to their kind of refounding conference and kind of like talked to them about, okay, what is it about Lenin? What is it about communism? And they said, well, the young people know that the socialists abandoned them. And we know that they're now calling themselves communists. And kind of when push came to shove, we asked them, did you always knew that this would happen? And talking to their millennial members, we said, well, we did think that Corbyn would present an interesting opportunity, and we weren't expecting him not to win the 2019 election in the UK. And then even after, staying in the Labour Party after Corbyn, it was only after they were expelled from the Labour Party that they decided to say, like, okay, it's time now to make a break. I think the other, the other kind of proliferation could be like neo-Stalinism, neo-Maoism. So it's less about Lenin and more about like Mao or Stalin, this like indigenization of communism. And then the other kind of area of this like was the failure of the millennial left, similar to the failure of the Second International, is the social republicanism, right? So the problem of the millennial left becomes that of like democratic suppression. So either their own groups weren't internally democratic enough, or that the problem of socialism becomes a problem of democratizing the state, or even constructing the state to begin with. So there are a few problems that like Platypus could open up from here. And I think maybe to link at what's coming in with the other speakers, is whether there was anything ever alive in the millennial left. Because actually, is the reaching back to the analogy, was the millennial left like the new left? Was the millennial left like the Second International? Is a way of kind of saying that it was alive in the first place, rather than they are kind of like sub-new left and sub-Kautskian. So actually what was, and maybe, another thing that could come up in this conversation is like, kind of assuming that they had the potential to transform capitalism in the moment of crisis of neoliberalism. And actually, that is also something that I would kind of dispute and try to open up, is actually what was the opportunity that presented itself in the crisis of neoliberalism for the millennial left. And I think what Platypus did in its founding moment was to say to think again, right? Is to actually say, okay, there's a proliferation and a resurgence of like the left. And maybe the best thing that we can do here is to take the ideas seriously, not take anything for granted, and use kind of investigation and organization of history to lead the way into something new. But I mean, I don't know, maybe this is what still feels like a bit of a question to me, which comes in like the form of this like Revolution 2017, is what kind of revolution? I think I'm going to end it there. I know that I'm pretty nervous and they're pretty brief, but yeah, I think I'll just do it there.
Did we have responses slated or?
Just go to questions.
Let's go right to Q&A. Richard.
Yes. Can everyone hear me?
Yes.
So I like that Spencer described himself as Generation Zero. I think of myself as the negative first generation, a member of the Trump. And so in that negative first spirit, I'm going to be a nattering nabob of negativism. This was basically a discussion of the history of the left during the time Platypus existed. And I wish it had been more a discussion of Platypus. I think that there's a wonderful story by Borges called Pierre Menard, author of Don Quixote, in which Pierre Menard, a 20th century surrealist, tries to rewrite, and he rewrites Don Quixote word for word. And Borges compares two identical pieces of text, which actually, interestingly enough, about her history, the mother of truth. And he says, but look at the difference between them. So I would suggest that doing Platypus in 2026 and doing the same Platypus in 2026 is actually very different from doing Platypus in 2006. Just to put things out, and I'm not going to discuss the Trump pedagogy, which I'm infamous for. I never thought much of the millennial left. I don't think it ever amounted to much. I didn't think it amounted to much at the time. I think that Platypus is increasingly becoming a Zoomer organization, and I'm not sure what the fetishization of the millennial left is or has become. I would like to talk about, since whenever one talks about the past, one is also talking about the present and future. I would like to talk about the present and future of Platypus. I think, and of course my perspective may be biased, but it's not, I think, only my perspective, that there is a kind of malaise in Platypus, a sense of just doing the same thing. And I think that the external objective situation of the left now is much worse for Platypus than it was 20 years ago. I think it's Platypus can do Platypus, but, when Platypus began, not only the absurd slogan of Revolution 2017, but the idea was that Platypus was about dissolving ideological obstacles. I don't think that objectively Platypus can be considered to have dissolved ideological obstacles. I think that if anything, the ideological obstacles, including a kind of ever-growing ignorance about history, are far greater now than they were 20 years ago. I don't read my own things generally, but Noah Spohr encouraged me to go back and read the 4 types of ambiguity. That was my contribution, I think, in 2009. And there was one sentence there, which was, we in Platypus may be the worst misunderstanders of Platypus. And I'm not sure what I meant by that then, because I'm a different person now. But reading it with my present self, I think that what is meant by that is to understand Platypus as itself a symptom of the death, quote, death of the left. And the death of the left has always struck me as a problematic metaphor, but I'll adopt it right now. Another difference that I have with the general analysis of Platypus in history is that there's a focus on microhistory, generations, Zoomer, Gen X, Boomer, etc., millennial. I want to think about Platypus in the long arc of the history of the left. And I think that what is most fundamental for Platypus in the long arc of the history of the left is not right now the bourgeois revolutions. It's not 1848. It is the whole history of what Hobsbawm called the short 20th century, 1914 to 1991. And I remember the end of that. And I would say that Platypus is, like the rest of the left, essentially a post-1991 project, somewhat delayed, but nevertheless a post-1991 project. And that in that sense, one of the great pedagogical failures of Platypus has been the failure to deeply engage with the trauma of the 20th century. But I would like to hear people's speculation and thoughts about the future of Platypus, what the feeling is about like the Zoomers who are increasingly becoming, I don't know if they're a plurality or majority soon, perhaps in Platypus. And Platypus being basically a Zoomer-led organization, which is, or at least at the Orcom level. And sort of how people think about the future of Platypus. I also think that, it's interesting that Chris is not here, right? Because if there's any single member of Platypus who has been essential to the project, the one indispensable member, despite all my fights with him, of Platypus has been Chris. And the fact that he's not here says to me a lot about the way that I feel that Chris is checked out from Platypus.
Can you pass it to me?
I think that, or at least I thought that my remarks were about the fact of Platypus being a post-1991 phenomenon, and the way in which you could frame it in terms of, should we say the millennial left in our opening comments at a panel, and that kind of debate a few years ago. And what I was trying to suggest is that if you blinked, you'll think that all we're dealing with is a continuation of the 80s and 90s left in a fundamental way. That's why I suggested that the anti-war movement was a continuation of the anti-globalization movement into 2005 and 6, and that the Marxian moment, or in that sense the founding of Platypus, was again a very fleeting instance between the anti-globalization or alter-globalization anti-war movement and the liquidation into the Democratic Party in 2008 that anticipates the liquidation via Sanders. So I was emphasizing the orientation of the left towards the Labor Party and towards the Democrats already in 2006 and 7, right? And so I think that, and so I was trying to suggest that Platypus is an extremely fragile project, one that is highly susceptible to its own self-delusion, to falling prey to a kind of pseudo-activity, that the issues really are the continuation of, obviously if you suggest that the anti-war movement was a continuation of the post-political left, you're saying that we're infinitely repeating the new left's failure to constitute a new left in ever degraded form. I also suggested or reminded us that to me, Platypus, to me it's a provocation to say that we have precedent, that there is Marx and Engels in their isolation. I am, of course, a student of that. They are alone in the 1850s. very self-consciously so. Trotsky and the Frankfurt School of the 1930s and 40s, Trotskyism and Adorno, the Spartacus League, and the best of the New Left, the dissident New Left. It's a very, it's a orientation that the left doesn't understand, right, what that's about. I think that precisely put that way, it's the problem with Trotskyists, right? That they don't confront the precariousness of being the last Marxist standing, that they can't see themselves in the mirror of the Frankfurt School, right? And I think that Platypus has to measure its success. To me, the question of the strangeness of some young members' orientation towards the millennial left is that they think that the millennial left failed to make the revolution or something, right? I think that the issue is the millennial left
Failed to make social democracy.
Failed to make social democracy. They failed to engage the trauma of the 20th century, to use your phrase. And I think it begs the question of the existence of Platypus. Right?
So do you think that Platypus could exist in 20 years?
I do. I do think it could exist in 20 years. I think it's a harder question to ask, could it exist in 10 years? Because I think that things will happen in 20 years that will re-provoke the question of the left. The real question is it motivated now? And will it become utterly distorted and self-betrayed by 20 years from now, right? So I'm much more worried about the near term than I am about the long term. Yeah, I'll leave it at that. Others may have remarks.
I was looking at the article that I wrote back in 2024 about this issue of the question of the potential of the millennial left. So I wrote then, I attended Chris's book talk at the University of Chicago, where he talked about the potential of the millennial left, and I said that I wondered if Platypus could be the millennial left self-overcoming. That is, if at a different temporal moment, those past attempts of a defeated generation could be reconsidered anew through our work. And maybe what was possible at that time was not a socialist party, was not a revolution, but the beginning of an inquiry and the insistence of a task. And maybe, as daunting as it may sound, what was actually possible was Platypus. We have to kind of face that possibility, which is daunting, I think. But I also thought that my presentation was about Platypus. It was about the experience of hosting the conversation, of making that actual, why we needed that practice, when we confronted it, why is it that we felt called to it, what is it that we were missing in our moment, why is it that we found it that we were necessary. It was about the experience of being in the audience, of organizing the 3 R's, of confronting this older generation of graduate students whom we thought knew better, and then we had to take responsibility for the project, all of which our current Zoomer students are experiencing, taking responsibility for Platypus. And, right, so my provocation was, look, unlike the graduate students who left, there are at least some of us from the millennial left who have accumulated experience over the last 20 years that are around. And so what can we teach you? What should we do? Because I do think that, I know that you're allergic to the kind of microhistories and the generations, but I guess I was recalling Ephraim's presidential report from 2021 about the layers of time that are enmeshed in Platypus and how we organize history. Right? So he says that at the organizational level, we've got the annual convention, we have chapters, etc. At a strategic and historical level, we have the phases, the first and second decades, the old and new left. But of course, there's a particular way in which the generational experience is not just about the left and the curation on our panels, but it's also how we make the history of Platypus and the history of the last 20 years of building an organization available to ourselves as an object of study. That the intergenerational conversations that we have within the organization seem to be critical to organize because they are dysfunctional on the left. And people aren't learning anything from previous generations, right? Rebecca said the task of Platypus, it seemed to be at the origins, was to think again. You know, like Malcolm Albert's like, don't do what we did. And then the millennials, I mean, sort of did. We don't want to make that mistake, right? Like we're trying to look out for one another and like the future. So yes, absolutely. Platypus can be around. I think, you know, the danger of it is that we lose sight of our mission, which is why we return to the statement of purpose. Creating the conditions for the reconstitution for the Marxian left. Are we doing that? That's what we should ask ourselves. Yes.
You know, let me say something, because I think in some ways my presentation might have at least pointed to the 20th century the most. At least I hope it did. That was the intention, right? Is that, okay, what was the left confronting, right, such as it was, the millennial left such as it was in 2015 confronting? It was like the actual kind of political detritus of the 20th century, right? It was the actual inherited social democratic organizations. And they were tasked with overcoming them, and they had a sort of false overcoming, where they declared victory over the old organizations and just reconstituted them in a new form. And that this happened both ideologically and practically. And in that process, what was liquidated wasn't actually any of the old practices of the 20th century, right? And it wasn't any of the kind of old dogma of the 20th century, and specifically, I mean, I'm thinking really about the identification of socialism with the progressive state and the orientation towards the administered welfare state as well as labor union bureaucracies, this sort of thing, right? They didn't get rid of any of that at all. What they got rid of was consciousness of the necessity of a new left. And so I would make maybe a criticism of your formulation, Richard, that platypus is a symptom of the death of the left. And I would say instead that platypus is, what type of symptom is platypus? Platypus is a symptom of the necessity of consciousness of the death of the left. And I think those are two different things, because I think platypus can't actually take the death of the left for granted. It's not clear that the left is dead or what it means. In order to say that with any certainty, you'd have to know what the left is. And I was trying to kind of problematize how the, you know, more and more complete liquidation of the left into the right, which I feel like really this moment is about, right? The Epstein stuff, the Zionism, you know, we're hosting panels right now that are oriented towards fundamentally right-wing categories, imperialism, technology, right? Like these are not categories that come to us from the left. These are categories of the right. So I was trying to think about how in that context, platypus has given itself a task, which is to find from within the complete destruction and liquidation of the task of the left, right? The complete identification of the existing left with capitalist politics. How it is that the task of a new left is posed. And I was thinking about how when the millennials confronted the old social democratic parties, they kind of misrecognized them as enemies. They thought they were confronting like their bitter enemies that they needed to defeat in the fight because they were encountering the betrayers. But actually they might have been encountering a sort of new problem or task, right? They might have been encountering an open question, right? Instead of just, you know, it reminds me of when I think it's one of the surrealists, maybe it's Alward, but it's one of the ones who's in the Communist Party, and they go to the students in '68 to go talk, and the students start throwing tomatoes at them. And the students don't do anything different in the end, really, in any sort of fundamental way from the older generation. You know, so I was really trying to think about how from within that like kind of complete negativity, like the flattening of the problem, right, where you seem to be reduced to like a sort of philosophical question. How do you think about something that doesn't exist without saying nothing, right? How from within that problem, platypus might nevertheless be motivated, because I felt, well, that's what motivated me. Actually, the moment in which Platypus made sense to me was about that sort of negativity, and I think this has to do with the Zoomers. So I don't know, as the Hinge generation cusper person on the panel, maybe I can say something about the Zoomers. I have been thinking about this. We're over halfway through the Zoomer generation, right? At least in terms of marketing categories, right? In 5 years, the oldest Gen Alpha, according to the internet, will be 18, right? So we're mostly through the Zoomers. The new people coming now to campuses are definitely different from the people we've been recruiting for the past 10 years in a lot of fundamental ways. They're not nearly as sectarian. And I have been thinking a lot about how harmed the Zoomers seem to be. Like, they've suffered, and they've suffered in a really unnecessary way. Because the things they've suffered through didn't have to happen, right? So we could say this, the liquidation of the left, the millennial left, that didn't have to happen. COVID didn't have to happen. The lockdowns didn't have to happen, right? There didn't need to be a decrepit kind of bureaucratic lab doing all this testing that couldn't control itself, and then everybody gets sick. Like, that didn't have to happen to them. The entire, the wars of the last couple of years, none of that had to happen. And I think the Zoomers are incredibly disoriented by this, because they want to take their experience as necessary, as anyone does. Anyone wants to believe that what they're living through is a necessary experience, that there's some logic to it or meaning. But in fact, there's not. And it has reminded me, Richard, of a different Latin American book. Though I love that book, and my husband, when he was young, tried to find the Pierre book, but it doesn't exist, of course. It's a fiction made up by Borges. But in Roberto Bolaño's The Savage Detective, a group of basically punk Zoomers, but they're really Gen Xers, but they're very similar, kidnapped Octavio Paz, and because they're angry at him. And the book starts with a young 17-year-old being in a poetry class, and he's talking to his teacher, Professor Alamo, and he kind of can't listen. All the students either are completely sycophantic and just do whatever this professor says, or they can't listen to him at all. And so the main character is constantly thinking about sex instead of about poetry. And then he starts trying to question his professor, and he's like, do you know what a triptych is? Do you know what a villanovella is? He just makes up random words that are supposed to be obscure forms of 17th century poetry, and he doesn't know what any of these things are. And he meets a group called the Visceral Realists, and they say to him, the Visceral Realists, we're standing and we're looking at the past, but our backs are to the future, and we're being thrown there. And obviously this is a reference to Walter Benjamin, but nobody knows what it means. And then there's this part in the book in parentheses where Roberto Bolaño writes, and every book on every shelf calls out to me to be read. And I'm like, this is young people, everything, because nothing, they want to find meaning in something which doesn't have meaning. They want to be living through history, but they're not living through history. And so they become completely obsessed with all of these things. And they think, they blame the millennial left. They think that the millennial left has overdetermined their existence as the last men. And it makes them very sectarian, and I would say very repressed in their own desires, right? They have trouble asking questions, and they have trouble listening to things that they don't want to hear, right? They do. They have trouble listening to and thinking about things that they don't want to hear. I think that despite that, they've actually done Platypus. I have to say, despite all of that, in fact, they've taken that situation as, basically a way of reissuing the statement of purpose. And I think the best example of that is the revolutionary subject panel that Natalie and Noah organized in New York City. And the very self-conscious basis of that panel was that, okay, we seem to live, we feel like we live in the end times, and everything's been exhausted, and nothing works, and can this be the opportunity to ask some basic questions and actually try to learn, right? Instead of just kind of mindlessly grasping at all of the variety of books, right? Can we recruit these older people who have thrown us in the trash, right, to teach us? So I don't know what's going to happen to Platypus in the future. I don't. I've always said that we can't just wait for better times. I think that, if Platypus is going to continue, and we've been doing it now for basically 10 years under these conditions, then we do have to try to turn this liability into an asset in some way. We have to love our fate, and we have to work through the experience that's been given us. So I think the main difficulty for the Zoomers, I've always thought, is that they won't be allowed to experience their own time, because they'll either have a false experience of it, or they'll feel like it's already been experienced for them by somebody else, and I feel like this is the obsession with the millennial left. And I do think a task for Platypus, and at least for me, as somebody who's tried to teach people in Platypus, has been to kind of open up space for them to have their own experience in some way.
Can I just add one last thing? Is it still on?
Yeah, I didn't turn it off.
Yeah, about Chris. I mentioned the fact that the last time I spoke on a History of the Platypus critique panel was that Joe Estes was president. And, of course, Joe was president because Chris stepped down. I don't think that Chris left Platypus then, and I don't think Chris left Platypus now. I think Chris just spoke on 2 panels, right? I think that, Chris, and now myself, there's no one to help us to say what our responsibilities are, right? There's no one who is peers with us other than you. And I think that Chris has made the decision that he has to embrace the role of teacher above all other organizational functions. And I think that he has tried to do that in an extremely responsible way, up to and including crazy things like continuing to hold the SAIC coffee break, which I tell him not to do, because he's tired. And I think that it's very important that when I think that there's a question of the relationship of our organization to our biological lifespan, right? And I think that in some ways Chris gave the best of his life to the first 20 years of Platypus. He gave the years 35 to 55 to that, and at some level that is where you are at the peak of your intellectual powers. And in another way, when you're in your 50s and 60s, what else do you have to do but to write up all the lecture courses that you ever taught, right? And I think that it would be a tragedy if Chris and you and me didn't do that, right? So I think that Chris has made very responsible decisions, and I don't think it's really fair to say, oh, he's not here. I think he is here. I think he is, I can't even, why does he go out and drink with us last night, right? So that's what I would say in defense of my dear friend, Chris.
Do you want to get somebody?
Also, I'm going to pick the question, but if I can ask you to stand up just for the sake of people knowing where you're speaking. Okay.
Thank you. I wanted to ask a question that I've talked to some people about, and I feel like it will relate to the history of Platypus. This came up in Aaron's report. For me, the panel that we hosted on imperialism at Columbia, it really felt like there was a disconnect between the reading group and the panel. And I suppose I wanted to ask the older members whether there was a period in Platypus before that I may not be aware of, where it felt like there was just no content to the left. Because to me, it felt like there was no left in the left. And to me, that really raised the question of what we are doing, what we are trying to learn, or how we can learn when it seems like the object that we're trying to learn from is so completely devoid of what we're interested in or what we're thinking about? Yeah, so I wanted to raise that question. Has there been a period before that Platypus has experienced where such a disconnect seemed apparent? If not, what does that mean for Platypus now? If so, what does that mean for Platypus now?
This came up during the Shit Platypus Says production meeting. I think ITSE called it, I included in the report, that it feels like Platypus members are going in with a gun into a knife fight, that you're kind of beating the left over the head with its own history and saying, like, don't you know, right? Like, I've read all these things, like, what about it? And they're like, what? Like, no, huh? Who? Where? We never said that. And it's aggressive, like, you're like, you did. And that goes nowhere. At the time, Andreas Winterschweger said, the left is not interested in the left today. Right? The left is not interested in the left. And I thought about that, and I was like, well, I mean, that was there at the beginning as well, right? Meaning, the reason we were obsessed with the Spartacus League on Iran, so that we had read all of their archival, their workers' vanguard, and we thought, oh, this is like an interesting position, there's a lot to learn here. We had like been boned up on the Iranian Revolution, and then we met them at the panels and, you know, at their tables, and they were like, yeah, we said that then, but, you know, military support, unconditional support for the opposition to American imperialism. We were like, but you said this in your newspaper. Like, in your newspaper, you said this. We read it. We talked about it. We learned from it. We took time. We paid for a little, you know, issue. Like, what about this? So I feel like, yes, that problem's exacerbated to a frustrating degree of trying to learn from the left. And yes, there was a time in which, at least to me, and I hope I'm not romanticizing this, but that it felt like when we sat down in front of the left, when we asked our questions, because we felt the necessity to do so, that at least what they would say would require us to go back and read more things and talk to each other and go to the reading group and, you know. But we were learning a lot more from each other and the reading group always. Like, the left pushed us to think, and in that way it provoked us to learn. But I feel like the newer generation of members have a sense, or have a kind of false sense, that, like, when we say learn from the left, we literally go to the left and it's like, teachers, teach us. Sometimes that happens, you know, certainly I've learned some things at panels, but it's always mediated through our organization. And you should be motivated to sit down with your fellow undergraduates and to say, what books do we need to read? What you know, where do we need to go to understand where these organizations come from? I was just yesterday, because the FSP was around, I was texting with Cam Hardy, another millennial member. I'm like, okay, Cam, like, I know this is a post-Canaanite split, the Socialist Workers' Party of the United States. Like, I was like asking him questions, right? Because they're raising questions in our panel. So, like, I wanted to understand, because Rebecca had asked me, like, where do they come from? And I was like, is it not, it's not Cliffism, it's something else, you know? And so in that way, right, like, we still are tasked to learn, but we have to task ourselves. Like, the left has become a degraded object of study for us. And yet, you know, like Rebecca's presentation, she kind of laid out, it then raises all these questions for me. There's all these questions, like, what is the republicanism, the democratic revolution? Why does the left espouse democracy contra liberalism? We saw it yesterday with Ingvar Solti in our panel. What is this, you know, the Stalinophilia return about? What is that? Is it a dodge? Is it a return? So there are plenty of things to learn still. Lots to learn. The question is how we do it.
Can I say something about this? And I hope maybe this will kind of put a point on what Pam said, which is, I'd like to explain the difference between us and the Revolutionary Communist Organization, or Communist Unity, and the presentation that Edith Fisher gave yesterday during the workshop, which I know not everybody attended. But in that workshop, Edith Fisher said, more or less, that one of the goals of the RCO is, or the communist unity now, sorry, I'm going to call them RCO, okay, but it's communist unity, everyone, sorry, is to collate existing left front groups and show that they don't need to exist. And so she felt that there's an affinity to Platypus because she was recognizing Platypus as basically helping her to show young people that other left groups' ideologies are kind of dumb, right? That you can kind of undermine what other people on the left are saying and like show how it's wrong. And then the RCO, because it's like incredibly anti-theoretical and anti-ideological in a way, actually, despite everything, right? Because it's just about programmatic unity, can emerge on top because it's like insulated from that. And the point is to like destroy the left. That's why I was thinking, destroy the left and elect a new one, right? Or dissolve the left and elect a new one, right? That's kind of what she wants. And it's understandable, it's an understandable thing to want. We're not doing that, and we're not trying to learn in that way. I think anyone who's been a teacher, right, and I've been a middle school teacher professionally, okay, it's not the same as being a professor, but I've been a middle school teacher, and I've taught 12 and 13-year-olds, knows that people don't learn directly from what you say, right? So when you're talking to students, you can tell them whatever, that's not what they're learning, right? They're not learning to like repeat what I tell them about. I taught ancient history, right? They're not gonna remember a single word I said, probably, right? Really, they're not. But they're learning from the conversation that we're having, right? They're learning from the way that the questions I ask them, the things I say, the things their classmates say, the things that they read, the things that they do, the objects that they see, how all of that sets their mind into motion and makes them curious about the world and allows them to think differently about the world around them. And I think Platypus wants that, actually, in a very earnest way. Right, we are trying to recruit the left to that sort of discussion because we think it's actually necessary, right? We think that actually everyone on the left, and I feel like a lot of people on the left actually recognize this in what we're doing, you know, like Mitchell Cohen, or even Dan Lazar, right? We know these people in New York who know that we mean it, right? And we're trying to recruit them to that sort of open-ended discussion where we don't know in advance what the answer will be. And I would say even though the panel, you know, it wasn't the best panel in the world, okay? It was very frustrating. I do think still the people who came to speak were agreeing to take part in that conversation. And, you know, it's what we make of it, right? They're putting it on the table. We asked them to come here and talk. They said some things. And there's a question of what we make of, how we're going to use what's been said and what we've learned from them, right, in some sort of new way. You know, so I think that's the type of learning we're doing. It's not, I know everybody feels like they can't trust anyone. You know, you need to be told what to do. You need to know what's true, what's really, really true, what the true materialism is, but you know, we're not doing that.
Karen, do you think people in the audience, Platypus people, learned anything other than people on the panel were stupid?
Richard asked me if I think anyone in the audience learned something different from that people are stupid. Blondine, did you learn something different what would you say about this?
I love everyone.
Okay, but I think it raised question. I think that we had a discussion of Hobson and financialization, and we had a discussion about Kautsky, and we also, the one thing we thought, because we hadn't thought of this before, was about why imperialism was a bad topic for Iran, the way it like doesn't apply to Iran, and that imperialism is in a way this like kind of right-wing category. We were thinking about its relationship to technology and about its relationship to life philosophy, like the idea that freedom is a natural process. I don't know what that means, but that's the discussion we had. Rebecca wants to say something.
Oh, I just, with Blondine, I've been reflecting on this a lot with a kind of ongoing discussion of panels, and I've really appreciated kind of Aaron's push to return to the form of it. But there is this exact question of like, okay, is the only thing we learn from our panels now like the negative? You know, like, well, at least they were symptomatic. And I wish that we had, you know, and the other one is like, okay, we need like better curation, we need to do like the better questions. I mean, that is our responsibility, but in order to like learn something from our panelists. I think with the format, maybe a way to think a bit differently. What Blondine's comment made me think is there was an experience when you first joined Platypus where you like really hate the left and everyone's stupid and dumb, right? And I remember from like just avoiding, like when I was first teaching the reading group, I was only doing reading group readings, and I would try to listen into like my left podcast. I like would cycle through like the Jacobin podcast when they used to have a podcast, which I think is now like dead. There and Navarre Media and I was in like my room in COVID, and I couldn't do it. I couldn't listen to them, and I get angry at them. And then when I had to do, and actually this was better when I could like touch grass again. I was hosting the reading group for my what was then the emerging like Zoomer generation. I was like, I'm old now. And I realized that our reading group was happening 1 hour before this Trotskyist group on the UCL campus was holding their reading group. So I started, bringing my students. I said, hey, look, we're going to do 3 hours of the Platypus reading group, and then we're going to do 2.5 hours of the French Trotskyist reading group, which actually aligned. We were like a week ahead of them in terms of what readings they were doing. It was like really uncanny. It's all chronological. And at first they were like, oh wait, these are like leftists, like what? And they were then like hit in the face with the fact that these leftists like read what they're reading and they believe in it. And so what I'm trying to do, and actually for them that's when like Platypus clicked, because it was not just that like maybe we can't repeat the Second or First International or the Paris Commune in the present, and that it's I don't know, not a lost cause, like lost cause, not lost cause, but that they believe in it. And actually that's how I started to like re-plug into like discovering the left, is I was like, I have to love these guys. I have to like love the leftists that we host, because they believe in something. You know, I mean, and sometimes they don't, and they lie, and they're there to like advertise, I don't know, whatever they're doing. Or, I don't know, just like speaking in front of lots of people, whatever. But I think for the majority of the cases, we find people that believe in what they're doing, and I think we need to think of like, what is it about our historical moment that is motivating that attempt to go find a meaningful history of historic transformation, right? Just as a first step. And I think it is harder now, because I think that we are in a very culturally conservative turn, which is being weird because I didn't think that would happen in my lifetime. But at the same time, I think, and I think that has a very, very depressing effect on the left, especially recently. But at the same time, we can still like find these leftists, and we can teach each other. There is a lot what's the other option is to not learn from it.
Can I say one sentence?
Yeah.
Okay, one sentence, because I know I talked a lot. You have to learn how to learn.
Should take some more questions.
Yeah.
Just 2 comments. This panel will run 3 hours, so we'll have questions. And also, this is a public panel. You need not be a Platypus member to ask a question. Hands. Okay.
Okay. So I have a question that I formulated it before Richard's first question, but it kind of relates to that. Hearing all of your narratives of the different historical moments of Platypus, I'm kind of struck with the possibility that perhaps what Platypus does in panels when we're engaging with the left is merely reflecting what the left is already saying. Like what Aaron, you just said in response to the most recent question was that, well, we're coming away with all these questions about the categories they're using and all this other stuff, right? I'm left with the possible problem that, well, what if our activity is only as good as the left that we're intersecting? What if we can't raise the level of discussion, or as you said, deepen the problem of the left with regards to the panel form, or with regards to whatever sort of questions that we're already asking? So I would ask, like, under what conditions is Platypus capable of raising the level of the conversation on the left such that we can learn from it? instead of merely mirroring whatever's happening. Because if we can only mirror whatever's happening, then we'll be completely prey to the degeneration of the left that we're seeing at present.
I mean, this is why the question of raising the level of the conversation is raising the self-consciousness about the fact that the conversation's a repetition, right? This is why I spoke about the importance of bringing the archive of Platypus to bear on our activities, but also bringing it to bear with your panelists, right? Almost every panel that we do now is a repetition of a past panel. Right? It's a topic that's existed. You should send links to the transcripts of all the panels to panelists. Right? People should think about themselves in the light of history. You should invoke the fact that these discussions were had in the New Left. They were had in the 30s. Right? The issue that the question prior to yours raises is that question, right? It's how, and I address this by talking about our many faltering kind of metaphors for trying to get at this. And I invoked the mixed metaphor at the time, right? How people's voices cracking, right? Now, what does that mean? It means the whole panel's voices are cracking, right? That everyone is thinking at the limits of what they can say, right? And what we're thinking about is how that forms a constellation. And that constellation is invoking the past, right? It's flashing up from the past. Right? In an important way to ask, who is our audience? Our audience is the dead, right? Our audience is the past, right? That's the issue of, are we rising to the level of past discussions, right? Is there just a degradation, right? How do we bring the level of conversation, the level of thinking of Marx and Lenin, to bear upon the present? In other words, how do we acknowledge that we are with the left in trying to do that? And the way that their voices are cracking is representative of the limits of our ability to bring to bear the history of the left to the present moment. Right? That's the relationship of the reading group to the current panel. Right? We have to see that the left itself is trying to bring to bear its own history. Now, does it evade that? Does it self-consciously disavow that? Pam talked about Stephen Duncan, right? It's going to be about, it's going to be some ontology, it's going to be some anthropology, it's going to be some Lacanian claptrap about the big other and the structure of the unconscious and so forth. A complete avoidance of the question of the historical conditioning of so-called fantasy, to use their categories. We obviously, on the Iran panel, right, we're dealing with the left that views humanity like a bunch of animal species, distributed across continents. This is the land of the mountain lion, and over here we have the jaguar, and there is the panther. Right here are the Muslims, right? And for them, their fantasies are Muslim. Right? They can't be anything other than Islamists, right? That's their civilization, right? These are very grim, of course, post-Heideggerian nightmares, right? That we're dealing with that are explicitly anti-historical, right? And yet they understand themselves to be communists, and they can't avoid the question of what that means, right? If you invoke the history of the communist movement in the United States, if you invoke the larger history of Marxism, they will answer, right? So that's what I would say, that it's important that our activity. I was talking to a young member last night, and they were like, they were asked, I think they know Natalie, right? And I said, oh, Natalie was my mentee, right? And he was like, what the hell is this mentorship stuff? And I was like, I never know, right? I never know if I've done what I'm supposed to do or whatever. And, what do you do? Well, you just tell them about, like, this panel was done in the past. The thing that you're saying, like, it refers back to that, right? You in your relationship to younger members, you try to open up the past of Platypus in a way that it can't be done otherwise. I mean, yes, you should read the readers that I've spent a great deal of time putting together. You should read Chris's books, all of those things, right? You should know the history of Platypus in that kind of formalized way, but it ultimately has to arise out of your interests and out of your activities in the present, and you have to bring that archive, you have to bring that history of Platypus, which does invoke the whole history of the 20th century. It doesn't just invoke the last 20 years, right? It invokes the question of the trauma of the 20th century. That's what our project has been about, working through, to bear on present-day activity.
No, just Richard, you'll get one more intervention, so think very wisely.
Give him the microphone.
Okay.
No, Nate has it.
So Spencer used a very interesting phrase, which was speaking at the limits of what was possible and the voice cracking. Now, what I would say is that Platypus at its best is trying to do that. That actually it's about Platypus's voice cracking as much as it is about the left. And that the problem for me is that Platypus's voice isn't cracking enough, and that too often people take refuge in a kind of comfortable jargon.
I mean, this is what Spencer meant when he says that the panel itself has to crack, because that's Platypus. Platypus is not, whatever people tell themselves when they're drinking. Like, it's not the cool thing that you say at the party to somebody. It's not the intellectual idea that you have. Like, the actual activity of Platypus in the world, like the reason we exist, and there are students that know about us and we affect our peers, right? And the only time we're really thinking is when we're able to be outside of ourselves, right? You have to be able to objectify your own thoughts. And so when Platypus is cracking, like when the panel is cracking, you are cracking. That's the point. I mean, there has to be that sort of sympathetic resonance.
Yeah. I completely agree, right? Like when you put time and effort and coordinate your little global call to get the Germans and the Australians, and you organize your panel and you go through your reading list and you have conversations, and then you put your panel together and you feel disappointed and bewildered and frustrated, that's what that means. And then you have to, have another conversation and talk to other members and bring it up and maybe write an article and have a conversation with Spencer about it. I mean, that's what we do, right? And sometimes it's disorienting and frustrating about our own activity, which is why we have panels like this.
Can I, just to point out where the voice is cracking right now, right? Because it just happened, and I think that's a good thing, is that, we can't answer the question of whether or not you're really learning. I can't tell you whether or not you're really learning from what's going on these panels. I can try and make you think about it. I can try and make you think about it in a new way, hopefully. But I can't tell you.
Well, we can also tell you when we've learned, right? Like sort of say like, we've learned some things. I mean, I'm 41 now. I've learned some shit because I've been in this organization. But then the question is, what does it mean?
Yeah,
what
you don't know
mean?
if it's going to matter.
Right,
Maybe
in
it won't
retrospect,
matter.
it's too early to tell, right? Because it's a risk.
Exactly.
That's why if the millennial left, all it added up to is Platypus, that's daunting. But here we are.
Do you want to make this point?
Maybe. I mean, I guess what's different from, let's say like this end of the table to the other, we're going back, is that we, I guess, have like increasingly more of Platypus history that bears on
You mean
this.
we're old, Becca?
Yeah,
We're all older than you.
I'm old. I don't know. It was like 3 years ago. I was like on the new members panel, and then I've got people coming up to me in conventions asking me questions, and I'm like, okay, I have to
what
like.
do you, an older member, have to say?
Well, no. I guess what I'm saying is that a concerted, I guess, like effort we've made, and what I've loved doing on like the SPS podcast, which is is the archive segment. And I think like Lisa Mueller, I think was feeling this like in the Leipzig chapter as well. They were starting to, or not starting to, but they were doing activity which to prepare for, they went through the like every time the subject was approached by Platypus within like the PR or through a recording. And she's like, we need to kind of reproduce this model. And as part of the archive segment, the way we organized it was between a new Zoomer member and an older member, whether that was a millennial or maybe more of a cusper. And or someone who's authored an object that's now in the archive. Where was I going with this? I don't know. Platypus has a lot of history that's coming to bear on us increasingly. And I think maybe in regards to this conversation we're having about like the panel form, that's been a question within the organization. Is like, okay, is the length of Platypus and like the self-contained history we have impacting the form of the activity that we have? And I think we've made a bet that actually this form is still very useful under changed circumstances. But maybe there is an open possibility of doing something new and different with it. I don't know. Maybe that's where should we do another question? Okay.
Mr. Studebaker.
So I suppose what I want to push on a little bit is reading groups. Reading groups tend to produce groupthink because people interpret the text together rather than writing their own piece on the basis of their understanding of the text and then being in dialogue with somebody about the quality of their piece. When you have a more one-to-one relationship, like we do in the old Oxbridge tutorials and supervisions, there's more of an opportunity for your particular interpretation to be in dialogue with that of the teacher, rather than reach a kind of lowest common denominator, conformist groupthink interpretation. And one of the reasons why so many leftist organizations suck is that they use reading groups to the exclusion of everything else. Platypus has panels and other things that are helpful, but I think perhaps there's still too much of a reliance on the reading group as the pedagogical form.
Do you want to say something about that?
There is still a syllabus in those tutorials.
Well, I would say, just real quick, Ben, I mean, I think that everyone in Platypus actually agrees with that. Like, here's the thing about the Zoomers, they're reading group addicts. They're like complete reading group addicts. And some of like the best young and brightest young students in Platypus, okay, and I'm thinking about Noah, are in 5 reading groups a week, right? One of the brightest young people in our organization is in 5 reading groups a week. Okay, what do we do with that? Also, it's like that also produces interpretations though, Ben. It does actually. It produces like opinion delusion, where people think that they're going to have opinions about all of the different things that they're reading. I remember this happening when we were reading Rousseau once, and somebody in the room was like, well, what are all the different opinions people have about Rousseau? And what are opinions that disagree with Rousseau's opinion? And I was just like, first of all, I don't think I can answer that. Second, is Rousseau an opinion? Is the social contract like an opinion piece in Compact or Unheard that like was written? It's like one of my professors at Columbia, Adam Tooze, said that Lenin was a blogger. If Lenin were alive today, he would write a Substack and go on podcasts, and he would be blogging about... I'm sorry, okay, Ben's laughing, it's making me laugh. But he'd be blogging about the world around us, and I just, I don't think so. And the Academy does that, like the one-to-one. Like, I do think, I take the criticism of reading groups, I do, but I don't think the solution is like the more kind of hermetic form of learning, which is good and it happens in other places. I've had this in parts of my life, right? Like I learned how to play the viola. I'm in the academy, like this thing happens in the academy. But really, like, why is it that Platypus like goes crazy over the panels? Is because that's us trying to get outside of ourselves. And that's when we're trying not to be, Ben, just the group thing. You know, and it's a task that we constantly have to reinscribe.
Sure, of course.
So, you know, that original fight between Dakota and Eric, the graduate students, and Chris, and which was about the philosophy of history or attitudes towards the 20th century, the history of the left, why Lenin, why 1917, was incredibly educational for us. We're like, okay, so why does this matter? And then it became part of our syllabus, the syllabus which is then subject to the membership. There are pedagogues in this room that have conversations over the course of the week. In pedagogue calls, they educate other potential pedagogues to take up the syllabus. The syllabus is then subject to us, the consciousness of this organization, to think about whether or not it serves us. What is our attitude towards the history of the left? There are moments in which Rousseau is read, Adam Smith has come into the syllabus. Those are important moments of changing the education in our organization, that we have to make objects for ourselves. So there's no fixed doctrine that we return to. It's a living document, our syllabus, and it's our responsibility. So sure, groupthink, but you know, it's our education.
I mean, I would say that a couple of things in response to that. I think it's an interesting question. There is an analogy to formal education. You invoke formal education by talking about kind of Cambridge tutorial model. And that is, of course, seminars, right? A reading group is seminar-like. And in that sense, it's appropriate both to the education of the undergraduate and the graduate student. What you're talking about is something that might be appropriate to graduate students alone, right? Who actually have a thought, right? Who haven't yet. First, you have to bootstrap young people up into all that they don't know, right? Now, there's a reason why what we teach can't be learned in the university, right? That has to be confronted, right? There are massive thought taboos around, above all, you can read Marx, but you can't read Lenin's Marx in the university. They won't give anyone tenure to teach Lenin's Marx. I don't know of a single professor who's taught Lenin's Marx who was alive in my lifetime. My best professors wouldn't teach it. Moishe Stone did not teach Lenin's Marx.
Bernard Harcourt in the left seminar at Columbia 2 days ago. Just going to say, there is a left academic seminar at Columbia. It's Critical Theory, hosted by Bernard Harcourt. Okay, earlier this week, he said to the entire class, because somebody was asking about universal history, yeah, but let's not talk about Marxism. You shouldn't talk about that here. That's the leftist academy.
Right, and I think that, but I think you put your finger on something, which is, what is possible in terms of creating intellectuals out of, leftist intellectuals out of millennials and Zoomers, right? I think there's been a real problem in that regard, not only in Platypus, but in history, right? Those that pose as the millennial Marxists are very depressing, right? Very self-consciously, or very, in a semi-acknowledged way, telling you that they're just a degraded form of some new leftist. They're repeating Althusser, or they're repeating G.A. Cohen, or they're repeating some other person who actually was trying to reconstitute the left with their thought, not simply package it for the future, right? If we have even a generous relationship to Louis Althusser, if we could say that. So I think that Platypus does face that problem. It's faced it in relationship to an entire wider historical circumstance. which is that to the extent that Chris, above all, has modeled trying to do that, trying to publish, trying to write, trying to have an influence in the world, trying to be a genuine intellectual beyond the bounds of Platypus, right? You can't get a publishing contract, right? You are accused of being racist, you're accused of being an anti-Semite, you're accused of apologizing for pedophilia, you're accused of everything on earth, right? All your job prospects are curtailed. It's an immensely adverse environment, right, to bring these sorts of things. And I can see the fear in young people, right? I've seen the fear in the millennials. I remember a young millennial coming to me and saying, I love the reading, basically in effect saying, I love the reading group, nothing stimulates me like this, there's nothing like Platypus, and I know that if I continue to think these thoughts, I will have no future, and I'm not coming back. Right? Those comments haunt you.
I'd like to ask a question. I think that the structure of the conversation so far might sort of falsely suggest that the process of teaching in Platypus is sort of straight temporally, that like the older teaches the younger, that there's like wisdom that comes with age. How have each of you taken up the prospect that of the phrase that's often used in Platypus, which is that joining Platypus is about taking responsibility of your learning through teaching? What have your students taught you? What is the process of trying to teach in Platypus stimulated in you that you might not have accounted or experienced otherwise?
I think I do go back to that experience a lot of returning to campus after COVID and talking to like my new kind of like batch of undergraduates and feeling that we had like, we're speaking a different language. And I had to go into, it was like, what was it about the last couple of years that has created this like big difference between the two of us, and how have our assumptions about like the world changed and what's possible to change about the world has changed. It's strange, like I think when in like 2018, 2019, in like the climate change movement, and in Antifa, you felt that we had 5 years and that we were very close to actually solving that problem in 5 years, right? It's an emergency, but that emergency will cause a revolution. And I think now it's more of like a bunker mentality of like, there is going to be climate change, there is going to be a kind of like fascist revolution, and we're getting ready to like hunker down. And I think that change in the perception of what's possible politically is what I had to kind of learn from my students. And I think in that process of that exchange, we kind of open up about kind of what the left was like or is like, how it's changed, why it's changed, if it's necessary for that thinking to have changed, and what they believe in and motivates them. I mean, I think with the Zoomers especially, like, even though there's this kind of like bunker mentality, nihilism, violence, like terrorism, there is still this kind of glimmer of like, but I'm doing it for the left, and that's interesting. Like I think I was just with the ACP guy on the panel the other day when he was saying like the most conservative like things I've ever heard about, like, and what you were saying earlier, Spencer, that like Muslim women simply do not want freedom. They're culturally different. But still he's like, I'm a communist. And I'm like, okay, what is it about that? And like, that's really interesting. And I think that's kind of what I'm learning from trying to engage and teach my students. Okay.
Yeah, I had a couple of thoughts. thoughts about this. I mean, I guess the first is that I think the term like generational transmission is basically a bad one. Because it's not like you like pass the baton from one group of people to the other. It doesn't really work that way. I think what you see like up here on this panel is a series of different moments, and they're all kind of question marks. You know, I don't think any of us really resolved the meaning of our experience for you, like in advance, in a straightforward way. So, you know, I think that there is like a task of the younger person to create a context in which we can teach you in a new and different way. Kind of the older people can't just tell you, like we can't be the textbook. You know, we can't be the inherited cultural object that tells you how to be, how to act, and all of these sort of things. And I think this does relate in a funny way to the kind of background question that this panel has had trouble addressing about the 20th century. I mean, certainly the image of the public intellectual raises the 20th century because we have basically a 20th century image of what that person is. I would say the same about the academy. And also that our forms of kind of learning, like the way that we have even structured our organization, come from the New Left, right? Come from the SDS, which in a sense had a very short life, right? The SDS was a sort of open-ended student organization for rethinking the history of the left. And that lasted about 4 years before they got embroiled in all sorts of other things, right? Because of the 1964 election and then because of Vietnam. So there are like kind of models we can look to from the past for how to learn or how to be an intellectual or how to think. And Platypus is about all of those being in some way exhausted. Like we're not following the path of the Frankfurt School, right? We're not giving lectures and we're not forming kind of a tight group with funding to write research. We're not following the path of kind of the New York intellectuals. We're not founding journals and engaging in kind of journalistic criticism and writing. We're not following the sectarians. We're not doing a propaganda sect. So we're trying not to do all of these things that we inherited from the past. And I guess it raises the question of our relationship to this, to like the inherited intellectual culture, which I feel like Platypus has always been trying to problematize in and through the left. And it's a different way of thinking about the 20th century. I mean, this is why it creates this problem about the 20th century. Because a lot of what the left discusses in the 20th century are specific political disputes, right? So it's going to be about, you know, Silesia, it's going to be about Poland, it's going to be about Hungary, it's going to be about the 1979 Iranian Revolution, maybe it's going to be about the bomb. And I think Platypus has tried to look at that history from a different angle, which is to say, look at the kind of symptomatic expressions on the left, not the most important ones, right, as you know, a way of kind of problematizing the inherited history. So there's I guess the reason I'm talking about these two things together is that there's an analogy between learning and between historical experience. This is an old thing. This goes back to like John Stuart Mill, right? People think about, you know, in capitalism, there's an idea that there's a relationship between learning and historical progress, and that these two follow a kind of similar mold of accumulating knowledge. And I think Platypus doesn't do that, right? We're trying to kind of pull the brake on that in some ways.
Spencer?
And I would just maybe just draw from a recent example, the pre-Marxian socialism reading group, and like what the questions that come up. You know, prior to the reading group, I had done research just as a historian and thought about some of these questions, but it's a completely different experience to be in a room with undergraduates, Platypus contacts and members, and the questions that they bring forth. And it makes you kind of rethink what you know, actually. It makes you go back and think, like, do I know, right? Like what Blanqui was trying to do? Like, what is Blanqui in relationship to Marx? How does Fourier make sense to us in the present? And so it is, and like Erin said, it's a kind of confrontation with their experience that allows you to organize your knowledge in new ways, and you end up teaching yourself things that are surprising sometimes in order for them to learn. So that dynamic, I think, is quite important in the organization.
Yeah, I think, maybe again, link it back to Ben's question. I think that one of the things that I've thought a lot about in through Platypus is managing the transferential dynamics in pedagogy. And seeing the crisis in my life, of students that are never allowed to graduate. Either they have to be clones of their professor, or their professor never took responsibility for their education in the first place, which I think is much more common with millennials. I saw that happening with the professors already, that they were like, oh, everything you do is great. All we're here to do is to promote your career and write you great recommendations. Or the experience that, for instance, Chris and I had with Moshka Stone, which is, it's never done, you'll never be a PhD, we're not going to let you graduate, right? Because you're asking the wrong questions, or you never learned what I had to teach you, which was there with other boomer professors as well. And I think that, managing the question of pedagogy in the sense of managing to think through what students need to know, right? What they need to learn, not what they want to learn, right? And yet, allowing them to work through that with you in a way that it becomes their own and the class is, in a sense, over. That's the hardest part, where you cease to be, you cease to be the ego presence, you cease to be the teacher that they look up to, some kind of ego ideal, and they become your peers. I wouldn't say that I've worked through that, but I've had to think about that. I addressed it in my comments. By the endless conversations that I've had with Chris Cutrone about exactly which writing by Kant must we make 400 students read, right? Exactly which chapters of Adam Smith, right? What Saint-Simon, what Fourier, what Hannah Arendt, right? How can we stand by this for all of these students that we're going to ask to be teachers? Right, which is again modeled on our experience at the University of Chicago, right? That we would have faculty meetings where the teachers discussed teaching their students and what in the world we're doing and why the syllabus is the way it is. And so I think that, especially when you place that in light of the transferential dynamics involved that we were talking about a minute ago, where you identify with the left, right? And the left becomes an image of the crisis of your own ability to grapple with history, right? When you really see them thinking as well as you can and pointing to the same aporia, right? And how you can try to leverage that as something that you can work through. Right, this kind of question that, on the meaning of what working through the past, right? How do you do that? How do you establish the conditions for that? That's what teaching in Platypus has made me think the most about.
Lauren.
There was recently an email to the list that no one addressed, Chris Cutrone suggesting what the high peak point of Platypus was in the period of 2011 to 2014-15. And I was initially disturbed by the mere posing of that question as like it would create a certain kind of romanticization or nostalgia for a particular moment when we are trying to look to the future. But I thought about it more and more, and I was particularly also disturbed because I thought that that particular period in the history of Platypus was perhaps the most challenging and difficult. What we came to understand at some point towards the end of that period was like what we called the protracted fourth and a half phase. A deep, difficult moment by things like the boycott letter. And so the course of that, me thinking and reflecting on that, I said, well, maybe I should zoom in and actually try to answer for myself, what do I think about that? And I zoomed into 2011. And I want to, ask you guys if there was this particular moment that you think in your experience of Platypus was a high peak. But myself, thinking about what was happening in 2011 as an answer that I wrote down. We were doing the Lenin's Marxism, Luxemburg's Marxism, Lucas Marxism at the Left Forum. Richard was doing his lecture series on Trotskyism in 2011. We were doing the first reading group on the bourgeois revolutionary thinkers that then became integrated into our primary reading group. What I thought about 2011 as if I were to accept even the idea of a high point was that we were firing on all cylinders at the end of the second phase. As bringing our pedagogy outward into the world, and that we were doing not only reading groups and panels and teachings and expanding the reading group, we were sort of really also expanding into Europe, Greece, addressing social democracy, we're expanding into Germany. And I thought that how interesting it is that 2011, of course, it's also when Occupy hits. And it's the shock to the system that I think maybe comparison would have been 2016. And I'm raising all of this to sort of think about, like, as an exercise at least, that how it helped me reflect on, like, what can we do, give the new students as a model for a moment, and not just in a nostalgic way, but to think about what was perhaps everything that clicked for you at a point in the history of Platypus, for the speakers, that could serve as a entryway into how we think about the history of Platypus. Pam is giving me a confused look. I'm sorry if I'm being confusing. I'm trying to see if there is such an approach, entryway into the problem of how we reflect about the history of Platypus in the present, as thinking about this idea of, like, was there a high point? Is it that even a helpful approach to the history of Platypus? Because for me, the high point was really actually one of the most challenging crisis moments in Platypus, in fact, if I were to accept that formulation. I also think 2017 was an incredible moment in terms of just looking at the panels that we were putting together, what we published in the PR. So it's not that I actually think 2011 was a high point, but just the idea. And because 2011 wasn't addressed today, and 2011 to 2014, 15 period also wasn't addressed, I wanted to put it on sort of the general horizon of our members. But nonetheless, the question then back to you guys is, was there a moment, particularly where, like, a lot of things were firing on all cylinders, and you were able to reflect on Platypus' own self-understanding as a result of all that activity? Because I'm also thinking about Richard's point about, the biggest challenge in Platypus is how do we understand ourselves? How do we understand Platypus? What is the self-understanding of Platypus through its own activity? And so, again, that's why I'm posing the question.
Thanks, Lori. I mean, I think this is in a way the background to my presentation, because my presentation was about 2015 and really early 2015 and the very end of Obama. And I would say that in a way, I was thinking about that moment as a moment in which I was able to, like, appropriate everything you guys had done all at once as a young person, right? That all of this stuff that you're talking about, right? Like getting into the Second International in Lenin, dealing with Lars Lee, spreading to Europe, especially to Greece, right? All of that was actually coming to bear on the panels, one of the very first panels I experienced that I talked about in my presentation, right? On political party and what is political party for the left. And, I do think, I mean, obviously there's an organizational form to this, which is that Ephraim and I were recruited at that time. And now he was president for 3 years and I've been president for 4 years. And, I think we've really done it together, but together, that makes us almost as long as Chris was president of Platypus. So I do feel like something about that experience like propelled us through and motivated us through what happened later. The way I took it when that email was sent, because I remember reading that email too and being like confused, but then trying to think about it, was also that, there was something good for Platypus about like the weird depoliticization of late Obama, right? Like the fact that people didn't want answers now about what to do now, about this or that. I think that seems like a great time to be doing Platypus, and certainly that's what it felt like when I got to Platypus. I thought that Platypus was about all sorts of things I could be interested in. Utopia, science, art, revolution, who's Rosa Luxemburg? I can go and just spend all this time learning about something that has nothing to do with present day politics, but everything to do with the left I'm encountering. Because it's not a big deal. I'm not gonna get excommunicated from my friend group and the world's not gonna burn because I'm learning something. And I feel like today people think that the world will burn if they stop and think, right? Like if they're not immediately instrumentalizing themselves to stopping the genocide, the world will burn. On the other hand, I do think that's passing. We are experiencing the crack up of the Palestine encampment moment, which was a severe kind of actionism, an intense actionism on campus. And I think it's opening up. And so I took it also as a challenge, maybe that means that the type of period we're entering, which has this doldrums quality, which forces us always to try and recover our internal motivation, right? Because we don't seem to be confirmed by the world around us. Could also should aspire to be as productive as that period from 2011 to 14.
Just to, I don't know that I forgot.
No, I'm sorry. We want to take one more question.
Wait, let her
Just
speak.
the clarification
Okay.
is that the key reason I raised it was because actually by the end of 2014, we kind of felt Platypus was done too. And exactly in 2015, Erin and Prime walked into our reading groups. So I also wanted to flag that. I talked to Brett about this and it was 2014 felt like we were pretty much done for a moment there. We were exasperated too. And I wanted to, because there's very few people left in the room that were there in 2014 that can remember how dire it felt in 2014. So I just wanted to add that.
That's really interesting.
What I would say is that the problem with nostalgia isn't thinking that the past was better, right? If you're nostalgic for your youth, there's good reason for it, right? At the same time, you're misremembering it, right? It's a distorted vision of the past that makes it nostalgic, right? That makes it, as it were, an expression of melancholy, right? One of the most elemental things that Chris and Richard and I brought was an awareness of the nostalgia, the false nostalgia for the new left that had suffused our entire generation, right? And the problem wasn't that that there was nothing to the new left. It's that the way the new left was monumentalized and the nostalgia for it was cultivated was a distortion, right? I don't see how Platypus can fail to think about its first decade, and I was trying to raise that. I think that there is a kind of trajectory. You can think about it as kind of all built in at the beginning, and also that it really, the full scope of what we were thinking about didn't become clear until the fourth phase, right? And I think most obviously the question of the party is where that comes out, right? In the wake of Occupy. I think that the question of, I think the panel that Erin was talking about was a kind of culmination of Platypus. Thinking about the capitalist state, thinking about democracy, thinking about the party, and thinking about Bonapartism, and in that sense, bringing a full consciousness of everything that we've been trying to appropriate from the history of Marxism. I think that in a non-linear way is playing itself out in the first decade through our different phases, right? Such that it now feels, so another way of thinking about this is that Lou and I are having a great deal of difficulty editing the third volume of the Platypus Review Reader. It's a lot harder, I feel like, than it was for me to do the first two, right? Which to me feel like a box set, right? Here it is, the first decade of Platypus, right? And of course, a lot of what I'm saying is, as I gestured in my presentation, I lay out in the introduction to the second volume. I think that working through a sense of, that's also why, by the way, I was raising the question of being Gen X with respect to experiencing the 80s and 90s left. If you didn't experience the 90s left as a degeneration, you weren't paying attention, right? You have to be able to experience that, right, without succumbing to everything is going to be new and all the possibilities are there because I just turned 20, right? That's not necessarily the case. And so I think it does, again, have to do with, why are young people joining this organization with this history as a way of managing and working through how they're relating to the past, right? That's all I have to say.
I have to admit that period is, it's fraught. It's also kind of a blur part of it because I remember, this was, I guess, like the time when I was on the organizational committee with Ben Blumberg. I was also the European coordinator. I was leading a reading group in New York. It was like an insane, exhausting period in Platypus. I do remember, though, being very much like, the time is now. And in the spread of our European chapters, which was incredibly exciting for me and for the organization, to just trying to translate the history of the left in these different places and having these, in retrospect, kind of exhausting phone calls to the middle of the night about how do you build the chapter map of the left? So, I'm having maybe somewhat of a difficult time kind of thinking about it in silence because it felt like a big rush of energy. But I think that it's right to say that the culmination of that moment, when we hosted, Podemos in Syriza and we had these conversations about the party, that it was in retrospect that the experience of Occupy Wall Street made sense, at the end of that juncture. But I do remember the exhaustion and feeling like, okay, so has this all been for naught? And this feeling of, has all this education, this work that we've done, and this expansion been for naught? So we had to, refound ourselves, reinscribe our mission, and we're probably going to have more moments like that. And it's a good reminder, right, that what maybe in retrospect Chris identified as a peak, which, I don't think is helpful, but in retrospect what he identified as a peak is kind of a moment of crisis and confusion at the moment. And it was is Chicago doing it right? Is New York doing it wrong? We had a big falling out over Occupy, how to deal with the Platypus and Occupy, very different strategies that were playing out in the different cities. We were kind of at each other's throats for a while, and then something cleared because our mission was reinscribed. And the necessity of our work kind of appeared once again. And, some people dropped off, some people left, some in a huff, some denounced us, and then the rest of us carried on. But, so it's a good reminder that in retrospect, it appears like clarity, whereas when you're in it, it appears like a crisis and a problem and it's difficult.
Just one line, I mean, whether you're talking about the second phase or the fourth, right? What you're talking about is how downturns are
Yes.
periods of growth and clarity, that in a sense that's what's Pam.
That at the moment doesn't feel like it, but it becomes a different.
I just have a very, just very, very quickly, less in terms of peak and more in terms of what was the moment that made me think of Platypus history differently. And again, it's weird because it changed in retrospect. But I remember coming to the 2022 Platypus convention, and so this was the first in-person convention after COVID, and actually my first ever in-person convention. And I remember feeling this like insane mania, which might just be a first convention thing, but was also, I mean, we were in the room last night that we had the Biden, COVID, and the left panel.
Where the guy made us wear the mask.
Where the guy, like...
One guy
was like, I'm not going to step into the room unless everyone wears masks, and everyone put on their masks, and we continued with the panel. But that whole week was really rowdy. Right? It's like most of the panels we had there, people were like, clapping, not being started by the Spartacus League, but members were like clapping, cheering, yelling at the panelists. We were all like so happy to see each other. And I remember asking you, I think, it was like you and Ephraim, I was like, could Platypus become a party? Right? I was like, I feel there's something like happening, and like maybe we're gonna like maybe this is like the new political positive project. And I remember you saying like, you have to think again. And you're like, but you're like, this happens, but you have to think again. And then looking back, I'm like, that was so weird.
You guys, just something to know. Okay, people in this room could not start a socialist party, and we would not be on the same side about anything. Okay, Spencer used to say this when I first came to Platypus. When the barricades come, the people in this room are not all going to be comrades. Okay, we're not. That's fine, but
I think my point being, it like changed when I look back on that, like going positive. I'm like, okay, that's what Platypus like isn't.
Yeah.
Right. I think, and that was like the learning experience for me of like this really weird mania and feeling that things were really meaningful, and then looking back on it and being like, that was like. Well, I actually think the internal, like the ORCOM and the President's Report were phenomenal, and it felt like we actually had a new generation of Platypus leadership that could define what Platypus was for itself, and I think that was actually the most important part of the convention. But in retrospect, I was like, oh, I can have really weird thoughts about what Platypus is and should be, and that's fine, and I have to kind of make sure I check in with people. Okay.
We have 5 minutes from 3 hours. I'm going to take one last question.
Are you sure? I think we should.
Can we wrap up?
We have to get to lunch, don't we? It's 1.
Well,
Yeah.
okay, then let's wrap up.